Tonight, we stand at the edge of a burning world. Not a world of savages, not a world of shadows, not some crude beginning, half-formed and stumbling in the dark, but a world of gold and cedar wood, of painted palaces, of scribes bending over wet clay, of kings who called one another brother across hundreds of miles of sea and desert, a world where bronze flashed in the sun like captured fire, where chariots rolled across the plains, where temples rose above crowded streets, and where the names of gods were spoken with the same certainty as the rising of the dawn. Tonight we enter the 13th and 12th centuries before Christ, when the Eastern Mediterranean was not a fringe of isolated kingdoms, but a living system, a vast, glittering, dangerous network of power stretching from the fortress citadels of Mycenaean Greece to the imperial heartlands of the Hittites in Anatolia, from the rich harbors of the Levant to the palace courts of Egypt, from Cyprus with its copper, to Mesopotamia with its ancient cities and endless archives of clay. And yet, for all its splendor, this world was fragile. It glittered because it was connected. It collapsed because it was connected. Across the blue waters of the Mediterranean moved ships heavy with grain, copper ingots, ivory, perfumed oil, glass, timber, weapons, and women and men taken in war. Across the roads of Anatolia and Syria went envoys bearing gifts, letters, threats, marriage proposals, pleas for assistance, and the language of diplomacy. Bronze did not come from one place. Tin and copper had to be found, mined, moved, traded, guarded, taxed, and transformed. Armies needed food, palaces needed tribute, temples needed offerings, kings needed loyalty, cities needed rain, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not see the collapse as those people saw it. We see it through ash, through broken walls, through tablets baked hard by the fires that destroyed the buildings around them, through abandoned rooms, cracked storage jars, fallen beams, shattered weapons, and skeletons left in places where no burial rites were given. We see it through stratigraphic excavation, through radiocarbon dating, through the careful study of destruction layers, through the silent testimony of burned palaces and empty streets. But they saw it as terror. They saw smoke on the horizon. They heard rumors coming down the coast. They watched caravans fail to arrive. They saw prices rise, harvests fail, gates close, soldiers march, and strangers gather at the edges of settled land. They heard the old promises breaking. The king will protect us. The gods will preserve the city. The palace will distribute grain. The ships will come. The treaties will hold. And then the ships did not come. The Bronze Age did not end in a single night. It was not one battle, one invasion, one drought, one earthquake, one rebellion, one pirate fleet, one famine, one failed harvest, one murdered king. It was something far more frightening. It was a cascade, a gathering storm, a chain of failures passing from one kingdom to another until whole systems that had endured for centuries began to tear apart. In the great halls of the late Bronze Age, there were men who believed they ruled the earth. The Pharaoh of Egypt carved his victories into stone. The great king of Hatti commanded armies from the mountains of Anatolia to the borders of Syria. The rulers of Mycenae sat behind massive walls so huge that later generations believed only giants could have built them. The king of Ugarit governed a rich port city where languages, goods, and gods mingled in the streets. On Cyprus, copper flowed like the lifeblood of the age. In Mesopotamia, scribes kept records older than memory, setting down the affairs of grain, land, law, kingship, and heaven itself. To walk through this world at its height would have been to move through a realm of astonishing complexity. Imagine the smell of smoke and incense in a palace courtyard, the clatter of hooves, the creak of wooden wheels, the bitter taste of dust rising from a road beneath the Anatolian sun, the slap of waves against a hull in a Levantine harbor. The calling of sailors as cargo is unloaded beneath the eyes of officials, the touch of cool clay in the hands of a scribe, the weight of a bronze sword at the hip of a warrior who believes his city eternal. Gods and mortals once walked the earth, or so these people believed. They did not see religion as decoration. The divine world was woven into law, kingship, war, agriculture, birth, death, and diplomacy. A storm might be the anger of a god. A plague might be punishment. A royal marriage might bind not only dynasties, but cosmic order itself. Temples were not quiet ruins beneath museum glass. They were alive. They were filled with voices, offerings, animals, fire, perfume, fear, and hope. Yet beneath the polished surfaces of palace civilization, pressure was building. The climate may have begun to turn. Rainfall patterns shifted. Drought gnawed at fields. The margin between harvest and hunger narrowed. A kingdom that looked mighty on a monument could be dangerously dependent on the next shipment of grain. A city with tall walls could still starve. A king with 1,000 spearmen could still fail if the roads were cut, if the peasants fled, if the bronze stopped arriving, if his rivals rose, if his allies burned, if the gods appeared to abandon him. This is the terrible lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Civilizations do not fall only because they are weak. Sometimes they fall because they are sophisticated. Because every palace depends upon a countryside. Every army depends upon supply. Every treaty depends upon trust. Every trader depends upon safe passage. Every city depends upon fields beyond its walls. And every king depends upon people believing that his power still means something. When belief breaks, stone cannot save a kingdom. At Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Hattusa, Ugarit, and across the lands between, archaeologists have found the signs of rupture, burned levels, sudden abandonment, administrative records ending abruptly, weapons scattered in destruction debris, fortifications repaired in haste, storage systems altered, settlements shifting, populations moving, old centers fading into silence. Lithic analysis tells older stories, but here it is: bronze, ceramic typology, textual evidence, archaeobotany, osteological study, and genomic data that begin to open the door. Each method offers a fragment. None alone explains the whole. The collapse remains not a single answer, but a landscape of questions. Who were the raiders who came by land and sea? Were they invaders, refugees, mercenaries, starving families, displaced warriors, or all of these at once? Why did some kingdoms vanish while others survived? Wounded, why did writing disappear in parts of Greece? Why did the great Hittite capital fall silent? Why did Egypt claim victory, yet never again dominate as it had before? Why did one of the richest ages of the ancient world give way to smaller settlements, poorer graves, lost scripts, altered trade, and a long age of uncertainty? We are left answerless, adrift to ponder, and perhaps that is why this story still grips us. Because it is not merely ancient, it is familiar. The Bronze Age world was interconnected, wealthy, hierarchical, confident, and deeply dependent on systems too large for any one ruler to fully control. Its people believed in permanence. They had ancestors, laws, archives, armies, taxes, borders, treaties, monuments, and gods. Then the fires came. In the burned ruins of Ugarit, messages were still waiting. In the palaces of Greece, clay tablets preserved the language of administrators who could not know that their writing system would soon vanish. In Egypt, the walls of Medinet Habu show great battles against enemies from beyond the horizon, ships locked together, warriors falling, families in ox carts, a world on the move. In Anatolia, the once mighty Hittite Empire dissolves into darkness, leaving behind fragments, successor kingdoms, and a question that has haunted historians for generations. What kind of war erases a civilization? Perhaps not a war in the simple sense. Perhaps this was war as famine, war as migration, war as state failure, war as piracy, war as rebellion, war as climate shock, war as hunger moving with a spear in its hand. Perhaps the Bronze Age collapse was not the death of one world by one enemy, but the moment when every weakness was struck at once. The seas grew dangerous, the roads became uncertain, the palaces lost control, the scribes stopped writing, the kings called for help. The help did not arrive, and in that silence, the age of bronze began to end. So tonight, we follow the smoke back across 3,000 years. We walk among the shattered gates and scorched archives. We listen for voices sealed inside clay. We trace the roots of tin and copper, of armies and refugees, of gods carried into exile, of kings whose names survived only because fire preserved the tablets that recorded their fear. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Beneath the tells of Syria, the ruins of Anatolia, the citadels of Greece, the sands of Egypt, and the seabed of the eastern Mediterranean, more evidence waits in darkness. But for now, we begin with the fire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And down in the comments, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. At the height of the Late Bronze Age, the world of the Eastern Mediterranean was a palace world. Not merely because palaces existed, though they did, rising behind walls of stone and mud brick, crowned with painted halls, storerooms, workshops, shrines, archives, courtyards, and guarded gates. It was a palace world because almost everything of lasting political weight passed through them. Grain, wool, oil, bronze, weapons, land, labor, taxation, diplomacy, war, sacrifice, marriage, tribute, and memory itself were drawn into the palace and sent outward again beneath the seal of royal authority. The palace was not simply the home of a king, it was the engine of civilization. Inside its rooms, the world was counted. Sheep were listed. Fields were measured. Women and men were assigned to tasks. Bronze was weighed. Chariot wheels were recorded. Perfumed oils were stored in jars and marked by officials. Weapons were issued. Offerings were prepared. Scribes tracked rations of grain, deliveries of flax, movements of livestock, and the obligations of entire communities. To modernize, these marks on clay can seem dry and lifeless, but they are the fingerprints of a system. Every tablet speaks of human breath. The farmer hauling barley to a storehouse, the shepherd counting animals at dusk, the craft worker shaping metal under dim light, the messenger leaving through a gate with a sealed letter pressed against his chest, the scribe watching, listening, scratching signs into wet clay with the sharpened end of a reed. This was administration, but it was also control. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces stood like command centers of a warrior aristocracy. Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Pylos, and other citadels were not isolated heroic fortresses from legend alone. They were hubs of redistribution and power. Their rulers sat at the center of economies that gathered raw materials from surrounding lands and transformed them into goods, food, prestige, and military strength. At Pylos, the palace looked out toward the sea and over fertile territory. Its archive, accidentally preserved by destruction fire, reveals a world of officials, districts, watchers, rowers, bronze workers, shepherds, textile laborers, and offerings to deities. These people were not waiting to become history. They were living within an ordered universe, one in which status, service, and sacred duty intertwined. Further east, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire commanded a vast and rugged heartland. Its capital, Hattusa, rose among rocky hills and fortified ridges, a city of gates, temples, royal buildings, archives, and immense defensive walls. From there, the great king ruled over a realm of vassals, rivals, allies, and enemies. The Hittite state did not merely survive among mountains and plains. It projected power across northern Syria and into the great diplomatic stage of the age. Its kings wrote to Egypt. They fought Egypt. They made peace with Egypt. This was a world in which rulers called one another brother while negotiating over gold, brides, borders, fugitives, and insults. Royal correspondence was not casual. It was theater, strategy, and survival. Gifts were messages. Marriages were treaties. Ceremonies were politics. A failure to send enough gold could wound pride. A delay in greeting could suggest hostility. A marriage alliance could reshape the balance of power from the Nile to the Euphrates. In Egypt, palace power was older than almost any kingdom around it. The pharaoh stood at the center of a civilization that had already built pyramids more than 1,000 years earlier. By the late Bronze Age, Egypt was an imperial power, rich in grain, gold, scribal tradition, manpower, and sacred prestige. Its temples were great institutions in their own right, holding land, wealth, laborers, cattle, and divine authority. The Nile gave Egypt a rhythm unlike that of its neighbors. Flood, field, harvest, procession, taxation, offering, command. The river was a godlike force, renewing the land with silt and water. Yet even Egypt could not live apart from the wider world. Its kings sought cedar from Lebanon, silver from abroad, copper, horses, slaves, lapis, luxury goods, and political submission from the lands of Syria and Canaan. And there, along the Levantine coast, cities such as Ugarit shone like lamps between continents. Ugarit was not an empire, but it was wealthy, literate, cosmopolitan, and vital. Its harbor opened onto the Mediterranean. Its roads connected inland to Syria and Mesopotamia. Its scribes wrote in multiple languages and scripts. Its merchants handled goods moving between Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. In its streets, one might have heard many tongues and seen many gods. Such cities were the knots in the great net. Remove enough knots, and the whole net loosens. Cyprus, too, held a special place. Copper was the metal of the age, and Cyprus was one of its great sources. Without copper, there could be no bronze. Without bronze, no swords of the standard kind, no spearheads in such numbers, no tools, no prestige vessels, no shining symbols of elite authority. But copper alone was not enough. Tin, far rarer in the eastern Mediterranean, had to travel from distant sources through fragile routes of exchange, so the Bronze Age world depended on movement. Ships crossed dangerous waters, carrying cargoes that could enrich kings and merchants alike. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Anatolia, offers a remarkable glimpse of this international world. Its cargo included copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, ebony, resin, weapons, jewelry, and goods linked to many regions. It was a floating archive without words, a sunken testimony to the reach of commerce and elite exchange. There is something almost breathtaking in that wreck. A single ship, lying beneath the sea, holding within its broken timbers the evidence of a connected world. It tells us that the late Bronze Age was not provincial. It was not small. It was expansive, ambitious, and intricate. Yet complexity has a cost. A village can endure by narrowing its needs. A palace cannot. A palace must be fed. It must receive. It must distribute. It must reward loyalty, equip soldiers, supply rituals, manage labor, and display abundance. Power must be seen to be powerful. A king who cannot provide grain, bronze, gifts, justice, victory, or divine favor begins to lose the invisible force that holds men to his name. The palaces were therefore monuments of strength and dependency at the same time. Their walls were thick, but their systems stretched thin across mountains, seas, fields, mines, and foreign courts. Their storerooms were full until they were not. Their scribes recorded order until events moved too quickly for order to hold. Their kings commanded armies, but armies consume the very wealth they are meant to protect. Their gods received offerings, but offerings require surplus, and surplus requires peace, rain, labor, and trust. Still, to those living inside the palace age, collapse would not have seemed inevitable. The world had endured wars before. Cities had burned before. Dynasties had fallen before. Kings had betrayed treaties. Armies had marched. Plagues had struck, and harvests had failed. The palace system was built not in a world without danger, but in a world that had learned to manage danger through hierarchy, storage, diplomacy, and force. That is what makes its unraveling so haunting. The Bronze Age did not collapse because it lacked intelligence. Its people were observant, adaptable, practical, spiritual, ambitious, and politically sophisticated. They knew how to build ships, organize labor, train scribes, forge weapons, negotiate treaties, worship gods, count goods, and command men. Their world was not primitive. It was a masterpiece of human coordination, but it was also a masterpiece balanced on many pillars. The fields had to yield. The merchants had to sail. The vassals had to obey. The miners had to mine. The scribes had to record. The soldiers had to remain loyal. The gods had to be honored. The king had to appear chosen, competent, generous, and feared. When the pillars shook together, the palace world began to tremble. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We stand among the ruins with fragments in our hands, tracing systems that once felt eternal to those who lived beneath them. The palace courts are empty now. The storerooms are dust. The scribes are gone. The kings who exchanged greetings of brotherhood have become names on tablets, their voices preserved only because clay outlasted flesh. Yet in those tablets, in those ruins, in those sealed jars and broken walls, the palace age still breathes. It breathes of ambition, of order, of wealth, of fear, of a world so deeply connected that its brilliance and its vulnerability were one and the same. In the ruins of the late Bronze Age, the dead speak in clay, not in grand poems at first, not in songs of heroes or sweeping chronicles carved for glory. They speak in lists, complaints, inventories, royal greetings, urgent requests, orders for grain, legal arrangements, diplomatic formulas, and fragments of anxiety pressed into wet tablets by trained hands. Their voices are small, formal, often practical, and yet through them a world appears with a force no monument can equal. A stone relief may show a king triumphant forever. A clay letter may show him afraid. That is why the archives matter. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, archaeologists have uncovered tablets from palace rooms, private houses, temples, administrative centers, and royal archives. Some were meant to be temporary records, never baked for eternity. They survived because fire hardened them. The same destruction that erased the wooden shelves, reed baskets, walls, and roofs preserved the words that had been stored inside. This is one of the strange gifts of catastrophe. A city burns, a roof collapses, clay tablets fall into ash, generations pass. The names of kings disappear from living memory. The language becomes unreadable. The streets fill with wind-blown soil. Then, thousands of years later, a trowel scrapes through a layer of destruction, and a human voice returns. At Ugarit, in the northern Levant, tablets have opened one of the clearest windows into the final years of the age. The city was rich, literate, and deeply connected. Its scribes wrote in several scripts. Its archives held diplomatic correspondence, legal texts, religious compositions, economic records, and administrative documents. This was not the paperwork of a backward world. It was the written nervous system of a cosmopolitan kingdom. There are messages from rulers to rulers, from officials to officials, from anxious people trying to understand danger as it approached. Some tablets reveal ordinary structures of power. Others seem to tremble with urgency. Ships are requested. Troops are absent. Enemies are reported. Help is needed. The language may remain formal, but beneath the formality, one senses the pulse of a city under pressure. The most haunting thing is not that these tablets describe fear. It is that some of them were never answered. A letter can be more powerful than a battlefield if it survives at the right moment. It captures uncertainty while the outcome is still unknown. The writer does not yet know that a future archaeologist will find his words among ruins. He does not know that his request, his warning, his careful phrases will become evidence in a mystery debated for centuries. He writes because the world still exists, because he expects a response, because administration, diplomacy, and command still seem possible. The archive preserves that terrible interval between danger and silence. In the Hittite world, tablets from Hattusa and other sites reveal a state that thought deeply about law, ritual, loyalty, treaties, succession, plague, divine anger, and imperial order. Hittite kings wrote not only as warriors, but as managers of an enormous political machine. They bound vassals by oath. They recorded obligations. They invoked gods as witnesses. They preserved diplomatic agreements with rival powers. One of the most famous diplomatic achievements of the age was the peace between Egypt and Hatti, following the long rivalry that included the Great Clash at Kadesh. The treaty tradition shows a world that was capable of restraint as well as violence. These were not societies ruled only by impulse and bloodshed. They possessed legal memory. They understood negotiation. They recognized the value of stable borders, controlled vassals, and ceremonial equality between great kings. Yet treaties are only as strong as the worlds that enforce them. The tablets speak often of obligation. A vassal must send troops. A ruler must remain loyal. A runaway must be returned. A border must be respected. A tribute must be delivered. A god must be honored. A king must respond. The written word tries to hold reality in place. It names duties. It fixes relationships. It turns spoken promises into permanent signs. But clay cannot command the starving. It cannot stop a fleet. It cannot make rain fall. In the Aegean, the linear B-tablets from Mycenaean palaces provide a different kind of evidence. They are not narrative histories. They are administrative records, and for that reason they are almost painfully intimate. They record people and goods as part of a palace system under strain. At Pylos, some tablets seem to show preparations involving coastal watchers and military organization, as though authorities were monitoring the sea and arranging defense. The language is bureaucratic. The implication is chilling. There are rowers, watchers, officials, allocations, bronze, livestock, textiles, and offerings. This is not legend. This is a government taking stock. The tablets do not tell us, in a neat sentence, that the palace feared attack. Ancient archives rarely give us the answer we want, but they show concern with movement, defense, labor, and resources at precisely the moment when destruction entered the archaeological record. In these documents, the human world is reduced to categories: men assigned, women counted, children listed, animals measured, land owed, bronze missing, grain distributed. Yet behind every entry stands life. A name on a tablet was a body in a landscape. A ration was a meal. A missing delivery was a problem that could become hunger. A shortage of metal could become military weakness. A delayed message could become death. This is where archaeology becomes almost unbearable. The tablets were not written for us, but we read them as witnesses. They do not dramatize the collapse. They do not need to. Their power lies in restraint. A royal inscription declares triumph. An administrative tablet says that so many men have been assigned to such a place, that so much bronze is needed, that such a shipment has not arrived. In such dry details, the machinery of a civilization reveals both its reach and its fear. Diplomatic letters from the broader Bronze Age world show rulers locked in a dance of honor and dependence. Kings requested gold, sent gifts, arranged marriages, complained about insults, demanded loyalty, and reminded one another of past friendship. The vocabulary could be affectionate, but the stakes were sharp. To be called brother was not sentiment. It was status. To receive too little was an affront. To be ignored was dangerous. The palace world was held together partly by language. The right greeting mattered. The right gift mattered. The right oath mattered. The right seal mattered. Power moved through ceremony as much as through spear points. A messenger crossing the countryside with a tablet was carrying more than words. He carried prestige, threat, alliance, memory, and expectation. Imagine such a messenger near the end of the age. The road is less safe than it was. Villages are tense. Watchmen stare from walls. Smoke is visible far off. Or perhaps it is only dust. At a harbor, sailors argue about whether to launch. In a palace, a scribe waits for information from a city that has not replied. Somewhere, a king asks where his ships are. Somewhere else, a local ruler insists he has no troops to spare. The words are pressed into clay, sealed, handed over, sent into a world that is already coming apart. Still, the archives do not give us simple answers. They give fragments. They give patterns. They give glimpses of stress, but not a single universal cause. They show palace systems concerned with defense, shortages, obligations, and communication. They show rulers attempting to manage crisis using the tools they understood. They show a world still trying to govern itself. And then, in many places, they stop. That ending is the loudest line in the archive. Not a proclamation, not a final confession, not a complete account of the last day. Simply absence. The scribal hand vanishes. The system that required writing no longer functions in the same way. Offices close. Shelves burn. Languages fall out of administrative use. In some regions, literacy itself retreats from public power for generations. There is a special kind of darkness that follows the loss of records. When writing disappears, history does not stop happening. People still plant, fight, marry, migrate, worship, mourn, and remember. But for us, their world becomes harder to see. The archive is a lantern. When it goes out, archaeology must move by embers pottery, bones, pollen, walls, burials, tools, settlement patterns, and the scarred earth beneath ancient floors. So the letters from dying kings are not only evidence of collapse, they are the last light of a system that believed everything important could be counted, sealed, named, and sent. They remind us that civilizations do not fall in silence at first. They write, they ask, they complain, they command, they appeal to allies, they invoke obligations, they preserve procedure even as fear enters the room. Then the clay hardens in fire. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Fire is one of archaeology's cruelest archivists. It destroys roofs, doors, beams, baskets, clothing, flesh, paint, grain, and memory. It blackens plaster, reddens mud brick, splits stone, twists metal, and turns the breathing rooms of the living into sealed chambers of ash. Yet in that same violence, fire can preserve the very instant of disaster. It bakes clay tablets. It chars seeds. It seals floors beneath collapse. It fixes the last arrangement of vessels, tools, furniture, and bodies in place, leaving a scar in the soil that can still be read thousands of years later. Across the eastern Mediterranean, those scars appear again and again. They don't all belong to the same day. They do not all speak with the same voice. Some cities burned through warfare. Some may have been abandoned and later destroyed. Some suffered partial damage. Some were rebuilt. Some never recovered. But when excavators cut down through the layers of earth, when a stratigraphic excavation exposes one occupation level sitting upon another, a pattern begins to emerge. Around the end of the 13th century and into the 12th century before Christ, many major centers of the Bronze Age world experience destruction, contraction, abandonment, or radical transformation. The earth remembers what chronicles forgot. At Hattusa, the great Hittite capital in central Anatolia, the ruins speak of a city that once commanded empire. Massive walls enclosed a rugged landscape of temples, gates, royal spaces, archives, and ceremonial routes. The Lion Gate, the Sphinx Gate, the Royal Citadel, and the Temple District all belonged to a city built not only for administration, but for awe. It was meant to impress envoys, vassals, subjects, and perhaps even the gods themselves. Then the imperial center ceased to function. The precise nature of Hattusa's final abandonment remains debated. It may not have been a simple storming by enemies. Some evidence suggests parts of the city were already being emptied or reorganized before the final burning. Archives were not always left as one might expect if the fall came entirely without warning. And this, strangely, deepens the mystery. A city can be destroyed in panic, but an imperial capital that appears to be losing its role before the flames arrive suggests a more complex unraveling, one in which power had already begun to move, shrink, or fracture. Still, the result is silence. In northern Syria, at Emar, evidence of destruction marks another node in the collapsing network. Emar had stood near the Euphrates, tied into regional trade and imperial politics. Its tablets, buildings, and destruction levels give the impression of a city caught within the violent instability of the age. Here, as elsewhere, the end was not merely local. The fate of one city mattered because no city stood entirely alone. Every destroyed center meant broken routes, displaced people, lost obligations, fewer safe stopping points, fewer stored goods, fewer officials capable of maintaining order. Further west, along the Levantine coast, Ugarit provides perhaps the most vivid archaeological tragedy of all. Its destruction was violent and final. The city's palaces, houses, and archives were burned, and the kingdom did not rise again in its old form. Excavation revealed a world interrupted, its written records trapped in the debris. Storage jars, tablets, domestic spaces, and administrative rooms were found under destruction deposits that turned a living city into a time capsule of crisis. The flames that consumed Ugarit also preserved its last voice, as if the city, dying, pressed its own witness into the soil. In Cyprus, too, the period is marked by upheaval. Some sites show destruction or transformation, while others reveal continuity, adaptation, and new cultural influences. This is crucial. The collapse was not a curtain falling evenly across the world. It was uneven, jagged, and regional. Some communities endured by changing shape. Others were abandoned. Some became smaller. Some moved. Some absorbed newcomers. Some shifted their material culture, their burial practices, their settlement patterns, and their connections abroad. The archaeological record does not tell a simple story of universal death. It tells a story of rupture. In the Aegean, the citadels of Mycenaean Greece reveal some of the most dramatic destruction horizons of the age. Mycenae, Tiryns, Medea, Thebes, and Pylos all experienced severe disruption. At Pylos, the palace was burned and never rebuilt as a palatial center. The destruction fire preserved linear B tablets that had not been baked intentionally, creating a final administrative snapshot. There is no great royal chronicle describing the last night of Pylos. Instead, there is a burned palace, collapsed architecture, and records hardened by accident. The absence is immense. At Mycenae, the massive walls endured, but the palace system that gave them meaning did not survive in the same way. Later memory would turn such places into the stage of epic kings and heroic wars. But archaeology shows administrative collapse, changes in settlement, and the fading of the palatial order. Walls can remain when institutions die. Stone can outlast the system that raised it. Tiryns, with its immense fortifications, also shows destruction and rebuilding, suggesting both catastrophe and resilience. People did not simply vanish from Greece. The old palace structures broke apart, but communities continued. This matters because collapse is not extinction. It is the failure of a particular way of organizing life. Fields may still be planted. Houses may still be built. Children may still be born. Songs may still be sung beside hearths. But the scribal offices, redistribution systems, elite workshops, long-distance diplomatic patterns, and palace-centered hierarchies may disappear. To the archaeologist, such transformation appears in layers. A floor of fine plaster gives way to rubble. A storeroom of large jars is covered by collapse. A courtyard surface is sealed by ash. Above it, perhaps, a humbler occupation appears. Different pottery, smaller buildings, less imported material, fewer signs of centralized control. The tell becomes a book of earth, but its pages are torn and stained. Stratigraphy gives sequence, not emotion. Radiocarbon dating gives ranges, not screams. Ceramic analysis gives phases, not the name of the person who ran through the smoke. Still, from these fragments, the scale of disruption becomes undeniable. Destruction layers are not merely dark bands in soil. They are historical wounds. They mark moments when ordinary expectations failed. Someone expected to return to that room. Someone expected the grain in that jar to be eaten. Someone expected the tool left on the floor to be used again. Someone expected a gate to hold, a wall to protect, a ruler to command, a god to defend. In some places, the archaeological evidence suggests haste, repairs made quickly, fortifications strengthened, storage practices altered, valuable goods hidden, defensive concerns rising. In other places, there is abandonment, as if people judged survival more likely elsewhere. But movement itself can become disaster. Refugees need food. Displaced warriors need employment. Migrating groups can collide with settled communities. Abandoned fields reduce harvests. Empty roads invite raiders. Every local crisis feeds the wider storm. The fire horizon was not only the result of violence, it was also a signal that the systems preventing violence had failed. Normally, kingdoms contain danger. They patrol routes, punish raiders, organize defenses, settle disputes, store grain, repair walls, and maintain alliances. When central power weakens, threats multiply. Men who once served as soldiers may become predators. Local rivals may seize opportunities. Vassals may rebel. Hungry populations may move. Foreign raiders may find ports undefended. A single burned city can create survivors desperate enough to destabilize the next. This is how collapse travels, not always as an army with banners, but as fear, hunger, rumor, and opportunity. A harbor destroyed in one region interrupts trade in another. A palace burned inland leaves merchants unpaid on the coast. A famine in one kingdom sends people across borders into lands already strained. A defeated ruler leaves soldiers without wages. A broken treaty leaves a frontier exposed. The flames leap not from roof to roof, but from system to system. And so the maps of destruction become maps of connection. Every blackened layer asks a question. Was this enemy attack internal revolt accident during abandonment earthquake, followed by fire? A raid a siege? A political collapse that made the city indefensible. Archaeology can narrow possibilities, but rarely does it grant complete certainty. The more carefully one looks, the less satisfying simple answers become. Yet the pattern remains: a civilization of palaces, archives, bronze, ships, treaties, and kings entered a period in which many of its central places burned or failed. The old architecture of power was not merely damaged, it was transformed beyond recognition in several regions. The great halls emptied. The tablets stopped. The routes shifted. The smoke cleared over a different world. Beneath the soil, the fire is still there. It lies as ash under later floors, as reddened brick beneath grass, as charred grain in storage rooms, as cracked vessels in ruined houses, as baked tablets in dead archives. It is silent until excavated. Then, slowly, with brush, trowel, sieve, microscope, and patient thought, it begins to speak. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. A sealed room may still wait beneath a mound. A harbor installation may lie buried under silt. A shipwreck may rest in deep water with cargo intact. A tablet may yet emerge bearing the name of a ruler in fear, or a city in flames, or a warning sent too late. For now, the fire on the horizon remains one of the great signs of the age's end. Not the whole explanation, not the only cause, but the visible wound left by an invisible collapse. On the walls of an Egyptian temple, the enemies of the age are given faces. They come in ships with high curving prows. They wear strange helmets, some crowned with feathers, some shaped in forms unfamiliar to the artists of the Nile. They carry round shields, long swords, spears, and the look of men who have crossed a terrible distance. Women and children appear with them. Ox carts move with their possessions. This is not merely an army, it is a people in motion. The Egyptians called them by names that still trouble the sleep of historians: Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Tjeker, Denayan, Weshesh. These names appear in Egyptian inscriptions connected with the wars of Merneptah and Ramesses III, kings who claimed to have confronted dangerous coalitions arriving by land and sea. The inscriptions present Egypt as the chosen land of order, attacked by chaotic outsiders from distant islands and foreign shores. The pharaoh, in the language of royal power, defeats them utterly. His enemies fall in heaps. Their ships are trapped. Their warriors are crushed. Their families are captured. Egypt is saved. But inscriptions are not neutral witnesses. They are royal theater in stone. They magnify victory. They compress complexity. They turn tangled events into a sacred drama of king, god, and enemy. They show what the Egyptian state wanted remembered, not necessarily all that happened. And still, beneath the triumphal language, something real can be felt. Egypt was afraid. Egypt was under pressure. Egypt had seen danger approaching from the sea. The Sea People's question begins there, in the uneasy space between propaganda and catastrophe. Who were they? For generations, the phrase Sea Peoples has carried a strange power. It sounds almost mythic, as if a single dark fleet rose from the western horizon and brought down the Bronze Age. Yet the evidence resists that simplicity. These were not one people, not one kingdom, not one race, not one army moving with a single purpose from a single homeland. They were groups with different names, perhaps different origins, perhaps different histories, temporarily bound together by opportunity, desperation, warfare, displacement, or the collapsing conditions of the age. The sea may not have been their birthplace. It may have been their road. Some groups named by the Egyptians had appeared earlier as mercenaries, raiders, or military peoples. The Shurdan, for instance, are known in Egyptian service before the Great Crisis under Ramesses III. They were not simply unknown monsters from beyond the edge of the world. They could be hired, settled, armed, and absorbed. In one generation, a foreign warrior might be an enemy. In another, he might stand in the pharaoh's army. This is the first crack in the old image. The Sea Peoples were not merely invaders. Some may have been soldiers for hire, displaced communities, maritime raiders, migrants seeking land, or fragments of broken political systems. Some may have joined great movements because their own homes had failed. Some may have preyed on cities because the old protections had weakened. Some may have traveled with families because they were not just raiding, but relocating. An army burns and leaves. A migrating people brings carts. That detail matters. On the reliefs of Medinet Habu, the land battle scenes show wagons carrying women, children, and goods. This does not look like a swift coastal raid alone. It suggests larger human movement, yet it does not prove innocence. Migrants can fight. Refugees can become conquerors. Starving families can move behind armed men. A community searching for survival can destroy another community in its path. In the ancient world, desperation and violence were rarely separate. The collapse created a world where many identities may have hardened under pressure. A man once known by his town, his king, his trade, his god, or his palace obligation might become part of a war band. A group once employed as mercenaries might become raiders when payment failed. Sailors whose roots were broken might turn to piracy. Farmers driven from failed harvests might follow armed leaders. A defeated elite might seek new land by force. The old world had categories. The crisis mixed them. The Egyptians wrote names, but names are not maps. Attempts have been made to connect the Peliset with the Philistines, the Danaan with peoples of the Aegean or Anatolia, the Shurdan with Sardinia, the Shekelesh with Sicily, and others with islands or coastal regions. Some of these proposals are intriguing. Some may hold pieces of truth. Material culture in parts of the southern Levant after the collapse does show Aegean-style pottery and new cultural patterns associated with the early Philistine cities. But the route from Egyptian name to ethnic identity is dangerous ground. Ancient peoples were not labels in a modern filing cabinet. They changed. They merged. They adopted new practices. They moved through marriage, war, captivity, trade, and service. A pottery style does not equal a bloodline. A helmet does not equal a nation. A name in an Egyptian inscription may refer to a coalition, a profession, a place, a people, or a political group whose meaning shifted over time. The evidence must be handled with care, like a charred tablet lifted from ash. Still, there was certainly violence from the sea. Coastal cities were vulnerable. Harbors were lifelines, but they were also openings. A ship could bring tin, grain, oil, textiles, and prestige gifts. It could also bring armed men. In a stable age, naval power, treaties, and local defenses managed the risk. In a fractured age, every sail on the horizon might carry fear. Imagine a watchman above a Levantine harbor. The morning light spreads across the water. Fishing boats are already moving close to shore. Merchants wait beside warehouses. Officials expect a ship from Cyprus, perhaps copper, perhaps messages, perhaps grain. Then someone sees dark shapes far out. Too many. Moving together. Are they traitors, allies, refugees, raiders? By the time the answer is known, it may be too late. Such uncertainty is the atmosphere of the Sea People's question. They appear in Egyptian texts like a storm front, but archaeology suggests a more complex weather system. Destruction struck some regions before the great Egyptian battles. Other regions changed without clear evidence of invasion. Some settlements show new cultural forms rather than simple replacement. The crisis was not a neat line of attackers moving eastward. It was a series of convulsions across a connected world. The Sea Peoples may have been both cause and symptom. They attacked because systems were weak. Systems became weaker because they attacked. Their movements may have been triggered by drought, famine, political collapse, failed trade, population pressure, or conflicts farther west and north that remain shadowy. Their violence may have accelerated the fall of cities already strained by shortages and internal instability. They may not have erased the Bronze Age alone, but they moved through the cracks as those cracks became chasms. This is why they haunt the story, not because they explain everything, but because they embody the mystery of a world breaking apart. They are visible enough to be named, but obscure enough to resist capture. They stand at the crossing point of text and ruin, propaganda and archaeology, migration and war, memory and myth. In Egyptian art, the pharaoh defeats them. In historical reality, the victory was more ambiguous. Egypt survived, but the world around it changed. Some of the defeated groups may have been settled in Egyptian-controlled lands. Some became part of the new societies rising in the southern Levant. Some names disappeared. Some identities transformed. The age of great palace diplomacy gave way to a harder, more regional world. The Sea Peoples did not simply vanish into the waves. They became settlers, enemies, servants, neighbors, ancestors, and legends. Their story dissolved into the Iron Age, into new cities, new languages, new conflicts, and new memories. What had seemed to Egypt like an invasion from chaos may also have been the birth pangs of a different Eastern Mediterranean. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No single inscription tells us where every group began. No mass grave gives the full answer. No shipwreck carries a sign declaring the purpose of the fleet. We have names in stone, weapons in relief, pottery in settlements, destruction in ruins, and the long shadow of movement across a frightened sea. So the Sea Peoples remain as ancient history often leaves its most powerful figures, half-seen, fiercely debated, both real and elusive, not monsters, not ghosts, human beings caught in the violent turning of an age, carrying swords, children, hunger, memory, and whatever gods had survived the journey. The sky can destroy a kingdom without ever lifting a sword. It does not need banners. It does not need ships. It does not need a siege ramp pressed against a city wall. It only has to withhold rain for one season, then another, until the fields crack open, the wells sink low, the seed grain is eaten, the herds thin, and the people begin to look toward the roads. In the Bronze Age, kings ruled men, but weather ruled kings. A palace could command scribes, soldiers, farmers, priests, merchants, and vassals. It could demand taxes and tribute. It could store grain in vast jars and redistribute food through officials. It could send envoys across mountains and ships across the sea. But it could not order clouds to gather. It could not command the winter rains to return. It could not make a dry riverbed run. For the people of the late Bronze Age, climate was not an abstract system. It was hunger or fullness. It was the height of barley. It was whether lambs survived. It was whether a mother had milk for her child. It was whether a king could feed his workers, pay his soldiers, honor the gods, and send gifts abroad. A shift in rainfall did not remain in the sky. It entered every room of the palace. Paleoclimate studies have revealed signs of stress around the centuries of collapse. Lake sediments, pollen cores, cave deposits, tree ring evidence, and other environmental records point toward periods of aridity in parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The details remain debated, as they must be, for climate does not strike every valley with the same hand. Some regions suffer terribly, while others endure. Some crops fail in one district, while another harvest survives. Yet the broader picture suggests that drought and environmental instability formed part of the storm. A drying world would have changed everything. In the countryside, the first signs may have seemed ordinary. A poor harvest, a little less rain, a spring that did not fill as strongly, a hillside pasture that browned too early. Farmers had seen bad years before. Every ancient society knew that abundance and scarcity moved in cycles. Granaries existed because danger was expected. Rituals sought divine favor because survival had never been guaranteed. But a prolonged drought is different. It is not an event. It is a slow invasion. It enters the soil first, then the roots, then the granary, then the stomach, then the law court, then the palace, then the army, then the border. When harvests failed, palace economies faced impossible choices. Grain stored for ritual might be redirected to workers. Grain promised to soldiers might be reduced. Grain reserved for seed might be eaten. Grain expected from vassal territories might never arrive. Officials who once recorded abundance now had to record shortage. A shortage on a tablet was not merely a number. It was a warning that the system had less room to move. The palace world depended on surplus. Surplus fed craftsmen who did not grow their own food. It supported scribes, priests, soldiers, messengers, metalworkers, textile workers, shipbuilders, and elites. Surplus allowed kings to build, fight, trade, reward, and sacrifice. Without surplus, the palace did not simply become poorer. It lost its ability to perform kingship. A king who cannot distribute food is a king in danger. In an age where divine favor and political power were tightly bound, drought could be understood as more than environmental misfortune. It could be a sign that the gods were displeased. Priests might perform rituals. Offerings might increase even as supplies diminished. Oracles might be consulted. Blame might fall on enemies, foreigners, impure actions, failed kings, broken oaths, neglected temples, or rival factions within the court. Hunger sharpens belief and accusation alike. In villages, people would have watched the palace carefully. Was grain being released? Were taxes still demanded? Were soldiers taking supplies by force? Were officials corrupt? Were elites feasting while farmers starved? A centralized state can appear strong when it gathers abundance, but cruel when it gathers scarcity. The same machinery that once organized prosperity can become unbearable when there is too little to collect. Drought also turns geography into destiny. The lands of the eastern Mediterranean are full of margins, rain-fed fields, river valleys, mountain pastures, coastal plains, dry steppe, and semi-arid zones. Many communities lived close to ecological limits. A slight shift in rainfall might push pastoral groups toward settled lands. Farmers on marginal soils might abandon fields. Herding populations might seek new grazing. Small movements could become larger movements as pressure spread from one zone to another. Migration need not begin as conquest. It may begin with families walking beside animals, with men searching for work, with communities asking entry into safer land, with groups seeking grain from richer districts. But when many people move through stressed landscapes, conflict follows. Settled farmers may resist newcomers. Local rulers may refuse entry. Hungry men may join raiders. Displaced warriors may sell their skill. Trade routes may fill with people who no longer belong to the old order. The climate does not have to kill directly to become deadly. It can weaken the immune body of civilization. A city already underfed cannot withstand siege as long. An army with poor supplies cannot campaign effectively. A king facing hungry subjects cannot rely on obedience. A merchant network disturbed by famine cannot deliver goods with confidence. A vassal suffering crop failure may refuse tribute. A frontier tribe under environmental pressure may move into imperial land. A port short of grain may become desperate for ships that never arrive. This is how drought becomes politics. It is tempting to imagine climate as the single great answer because it feels vast enough for the scale of the ruin. But ancient history rarely gives us such clean simplicity. Not every burned city burned because of drought. Not every migrant moved because of failed rain. Not every palace fell because its granaries emptied. Human decisions mattered. War mattered. Ambition mattered. Trade mattered. Earthquakes, rebellion, piracy, and dynastic weakness mattered. Yet climate may have been the pressure that made every other pressure harder to bear. Think of a bronze sword held in a flame. The metal does not melt at once. First it heats, then it softens. Then its strength changes. Strike it at the wrong moment, and it bends or breaks. So too with kingdoms. Drought may not have been the sword stroke, but it may have heated the blade of civilization until older blows became fatal. The evidence lies not only in ruined palaces, but in the ancient environment itself. Pollen can show changes in vegetation. Lake levels can reveal shifting water balance. Cave deposits can preserve chemical traces of rainfall. Charred seeds can show what people grew and stored. Animal bones can reveal changing herding strategies. Settlement patterns can show movement away from vulnerable zones. Archaeobotany and environmental reconstruction do not speak in the language of kings, but they speak in older tongues. Soil, seed, water, bone. These records remind us that civilization is not separate from nature. The palace may have seemed to stand above the landscape, but it was made from it. Mud brick from earth, timber from forests, food from fields, wool from flocks, copper from mines, ships from trees, labor from bodies fed by grain. Even the gods were honored through offerings grown, herded, pressed, brewed, and slaughtered. When the environment changed, the sacred and political order changed with it. Imagine a year of failed rain in a kingdom already nervous. Officials travel to collect grain and find local storehouses nearly empty. Farmers plead for relief. Shepherds report dying animals. Priests demand offerings to restore balance. Soldiers grumble because rations are cut. Merchants raise prices because fewer shipments arrive. Refugees appear at the city gate. Rumors spread that another city has fallen. The king sends orders, but orders do not fill jars. Now imagine the next year is worse. At some point, crisis becomes a memory that shapes behavior. People stop believing recovery is certain. They hide food. They flee early. They refuse obligations. They seek new patrons. They abandon old loyalties. The palace discovers that its authority depended not only on walls and weapons, but on the expectation that the system would continue to provide. When expectation dies, collapse becomes visible. Still, the ancient drought remains partly veiled. We can measure traces, compare records, build models, and argue over dates. We can see that climate stress formed part of the age's burden, but we cannot hear the prayer spoken by a farmer under a rainless sky. We cannot know the exact moment when a family decided to leave its field. We cannot see the face of the official sent to collect taxes from a village with nothing left to give, and so we remain, in some measure, answerless, adrift to ponder. A civilization of bronze, palace, ship, and archive found itself beneath a changing heaven. The clouds failed. The fields weakened. The stores emptied. Men moved. Kings promised. Priests prayed. Soldiers waited. The sky stayed silent. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. But the lesson already rises from the dust with terrible clarity. The end of a world may begin with no sound at all, only dry wind over empty fields. The earth can betray a city from beneath its own foundations. No enemy appears at the gate. No sail darkens the horizon. No messenger arrives gasping for breath with news of invasion. The day begins with ordinary sounds, animals in courtyards, women grinding grain, metal workers striking bronze, children running in dust, priests preparing offerings, scribes bending over tablets, guards leaning against sun-warmed stone. Then the ground moves. At first perhaps a low sound, deep and animal, rising from below the world. Then walls shiver, jars rattle, roof beams groan, mud brick cracks. People look upward. A second later, the city becomes noise. Stone grinding on stone, pottery breaking, screams in narrow lanes, dust-filling rooms. The familiar earth, the one thing that should be still, becomes violent. In the lands of the eastern Mediterranean, earthquakes were never strangers. Anatolia, the Aegean, Cyprus, the Levant, and the surrounding regions lie within a restless geological zone, crossed by faults, pressed by moving plates, shaped by forces older than any kingdom. Mountains rise there because the earth is not at peace. Coastlines shift, springs change, walls fall. In such a world, every generation might know tremors, but some moments are stronger than memory can easily contain. Archaeoseismology, the study of ancient earthquake damage, asks whether the ruins preserve evidence of these unseen blows. It looks for walls fallen in consistent directions, crushed floors, displaced blocks, tilted structures, sudden repair phases, skeletons trapped beneath collapse, and damage patterns that differ from ordinary warfare. It is a careful and difficult science. Fire can follow earthquake. Looting can disturb ruins. Later builders can remove stones. A city destroyed by soldiers may look, in parts, like a city broken by shock. The ground does not sign its name. Still, the question remains powerful. Could earthquakes have helped bring down the palace world? The idea is tempting because destruction layers appear across many places. Great centers in Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant show signs of damage or rebuilding during the troubled centuries. Some scholars have suggested that an earthquake storm, a sequence of major tremors across decades, may have weakened cities already strained by other pressures. Not one quake ending the age, but repeated shocks damaging fortifications, palaces, roads, storage systems, and morale. A single earthquake does not need to destroy an empire to change history. It only has to strike at the wrong moment. Imagine a palace already facing grain shortages, political rivalry, and threats along the coast. Now the ground splits walls and collapses storerooms. Grain jars break. Administrative rooms become rubble. Workers must be diverted from fields to repairs. Timber must be cut for rebuilding. Stone must be moved. Labor must be commanded. The king must prove that order still stands. Even as everyone has seen the walls fall, an earthquake is not merely physical damage. It is a religious and political crisis. In a world where gods governed storm, land, sea, fertility, and kingship, the shaking of the earth could not be dismissed as blind mechanics. It demanded interpretation. Had a god been angered? Had rituals failed? had the king lost favor, had an oath been broken. Priests might search for causes in divine displeasure, while officials searched for labor and materials. The same cracked wall could be both engineering problem and cosmic warning. That combination is dangerous. A strong kingdom can rebuild after disaster. It can mobilize labor, distribute food, reassure subjects, and turn reconstruction into royal glory. Many ancient states did exactly that. But when disasters arrive in clusters, each one steals capacity from the next response. Repair one gate, and another frontier goes unguarded. Rebuild a temple, and granaries remain damaged. Feed work crews, and soldiers receive less. A palace system can absorb shocks until the shocks begin to overlap. The Aegean offers vivid landscapes for such fears. The great Mycenaean citadels were built from immense stones. Their walls seem almost invulnerable, heavy with the confidence of warrior elites. Yet even great walls depend on foundations, joints, slopes, and maintenance. An earthquake can open cracks where enemies later enter. It can damage cisterns, access roads, stairways, gate complexes, storage rooms, and elite residences. It can shake loose not only stone, but faith. At Tiryns, complex building histories and evidence of damage and repair have prompted debate about seismic events. At Mycenae, too. Destruction and rebuilding phases complicate the picture. Some damage may have been caused by earthquakes, some by human violence, some by the slow fatigue of architecture in a troubled age. The ruins do not yield their meanings easily. They make us patient. In Anatolia, the situation is equally compelling. Hattusa stood in rugged terrain, its defenses following hills and ridges. Such places are grand, but geology is not impressed by grandeur. Fortified cities built on slopes can suffer from shaking, landslides, collapsing walls, and disrupted water systems. Even if final abandonment was political, economic, or military, seismic damage could have weakened the structures and strained the resources needed to maintain imperial authority. Along the Levantine coast, cities faced other hazards. Earthquakes could damage harbors, warehouses, walls, and temples. They could trigger fires. They could alter springs or disrupt routes. A port city lives by movement, but movement depends on infrastructure. Break the quay, collapse the storehouse, damage the gate, and the city loses more than stone. It loses rhythm. Yet the earthquake theory must be handled with caution. Ancient destruction is rarely simple. A fallen wall may tempt us to imagine a quake, but armies also topple walls. A burned room may suggest warfare, but earthquakes can ignite fires when lamps, hearths, and storage materials are disturbed. A rebuilt structure may reflect prosperity rather than disaster. Archaeology demands discipline. It asks not only what could have happened, but what the evidence truly permits. The deeper significance of earthquakes may lie in their role as accelerants. They may not explain the collapse by themselves. They may not have arrived everywhere at once. They may not have toppled every palace or driven every migration. But in an age already strained by drought, disrupted trade, military pressure, rebellion, and fragile administration, seismic damage could have added yet another burden. The earth shook, and systems with little spare strength had to spend what remained. This is the terror of cascading collapse. The first disaster is survived. The second is endured. The third is answered with difficulty. The fourth arrives when tools are blunt, granaries low, officials exhausted, allies unreliable, and laborers resentful. A kingdom that might once have rebuilt magnificently now patches, delays, compromises, and praise. The cracks in the wall become cracks in authority. For ordinary people, the experience would have been immediate and unforgettable. A woman trapped under a fallen roof, a potter losing his kiln, a priest entering a damaged shrine, a child afraid to sleep indoors, a farmer called away from harvest to haul stone, a scribe watching tablets scatter across a fractured floor, a ruler ordering repairs while envoys whisper that the city no longer appears invincible. The palace was built to project permanence. Earthquakes exposed its mortality. There is something almost symbolic in this. The Bronze Age elite loved heavy things. Thick walls, stone gates, bronze weapons, carved monuments, sealed archives, storerooms packed with jars. Their power was material, visible, and weighty. But the forces that undid them were often invisible until too late failed rain. Broken trust, disrupted trade, moving peoples, and the deep pressure of the earth itself. A city may fall from a blow no warrior can parry, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We can identify damage patterns, test sediments, compare regional sequences, and reconstruct ancient fault activity. We can map destruction and repair. We can place earthquakes among the suspects. But the ground does not preserve fear in words. It leaves angles, cracks, fallen stones, and silence. Perhaps in some cities, people rebuilt and carried on. Perhaps in others, the shaking became one more sign that the gods had turned away. Perhaps a wall cracked by earthquake stood long enough for raiders to burn what remained. Perhaps a palace weakened by tremor failed in a later siege. Perhaps a community, already hungry and afraid, simply chose not to rebuild. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Beneath collapsed stones, beneath tilted walls, beneath floors sealed by rubble, the earth may still hold evidence of the moments when it moved, not as the single murderer of the Bronze Age, but as one of the ancient accomplices of ruin. For kingdoms may fear enemies. They may fear famine. They may fear rebellion. But there is a deeper fear still. The knowledge that even the ground beneath the throne can rise against the king. Bronze was the metal of kings, but bronze was also a problem. It did not lie waiting in one convenient mountain, ready for any ruler to dig from the earth and shape into swords. It was an alloy, a marriage of materials drawn from different landscapes, different peoples, different dangers. Copper could be found in several regions, with Cyprus standing among the great sources of the eastern Mediterranean. Tin was rarer, more elusive, and often had to travel from far away through networks that stretched beyond the comfortable reach of palace control. To make bronze, a civilization had to trust the road. That truth sits at the heart of the age. The shining blade in a warrior's hand was not merely a weapon. It was evidence of miners, smelters, merchants, sailors, pack animals, officials, guards, agreements, weights, harbors, storehouses, and safe passage. It was geology turned into politics. It was distance hardened into metal. A bronze sword carried a map inside it. Copper may have come from Cyprus, from Anatolia, from the southern Levant, from other sources known and unknown. Tin may have moved through long overland corridors, down river systems, across mountain passes, or through merchant chains so ancient and complex that even the kings who benefited from them may not have understood every link. A palace could command the final distribution of metal, but it could not easily command every mine, caravan, island, market, storm, and border along the way. This made bronze powerful, prestigious, and vulnerable. In ordinary times, The movement of metal fed the machinery of elite life. Ingots arrived by ship or caravan. Officials weighed them. Craftsmen transformed them. Smiths made blades, spearheads, arrowheads, axes, chisels, razors, pins, vessels, fittings, and ceremonial objects. Metal equipped soldiers, decorated aristocrats, built tools, rewarded loyalty, and displayed royal magnificence. But when roots failed, metal became hunger of another kind. A kingdom could not eat bronze, but without bronze it could struggle to fight, farm, build, repair, reward, and impress. Tools wore out. Weapons broke. Chariot fittings needed maintenance. Ships required fastenings and tools. Temples expected offerings. Elites expected gifts. A palace that could no longer supply metal risked losing both practical capacity and symbolic authority. The price of tin was not only measured in weight, it was measured in dependency. No palace economy, however proud, stood alone. A ruler could claim divine favor, command armies, and carve victories into stone, yet still require materials from people beyond his direct power. This was the paradox of late Bronze Age grandeur. Its wealth came from long-distance exchange. Its weakness came from the same exchange. The more magnificent the system became, the more it needed distant things to keep moving. Ships were the lifeblood of this world. They carried copper oxide ingots, shaped for transport and handling. They carried tin, glass, ivory, timber, oil, wine, textiles, resin, spices, and luxury goods. They hugged coastlines, crossed open waters, entered harbors, waited for winds, and risked reefs, storms, pirates, and politics. Every cargo was a bet that the world would remain predictable long enough for the voyage to matter. A ship leaving port entered uncertainty. The harbor behind it might be safe. The harbor ahead might not. A friendly ruler could die before arrival. A city might fall. A coastline might swarm with raiders. A storm might scatter the fleet. A customs official might demand more than expected. A local war might close the route. In a connected age, trade required not just goods, but confidence. Confidence is invisible until it disappears. When merchants begin to fear the sea, fewer ships sail. When fewer ships sail, shortages grow. When shortages grow, prices rise. When prices rise, rulers hoard. When rulers hoard, allies complain. When allies complain, trust weakens. When trust weakens, the entire diplomatic and commercial order begins to stiffen like a body losing blood. Metal shortages may not always appear in the archaeological record as neat, empty shelves. The evidence is subtler. Increased recycling, broken objects melted down, changes in weapon types, hoards buried and never recovered, local improvisation, reduced access to imported goods, a shift from broad palace-controlled production to smaller, more regional patterns. Material culture becomes a record of adaptation under stress. A bronze object found in the ground may therefore carry two stories. One is the story of manufacture ore, furnace, hammer, mold, polish, use. The other is the story of value, why it was kept, repaired, buried, offered, stolen, or abandoned. In times of stability, metal circulates within systems of production and status. In times of fear, metal may disappear into hiding places. A hoard buried beneath a floor or outside a settlement can feel like a whisper from someone expecting to return. Perhaps they never did. Trade collapse does not require every route to close. It only requires enough uncertainty to make the old system unreliable. The palace world depended on regularity. Officials could plan if goods arrived within expected rhythms. Armies could be equipped if bronze stores were predictable. Workshops could function if raw materials came in steady quantities. Diplomatic gifts could be sent if luxury materials remained available. But a few broken links could create a widening crisis. Imagine a copper shipment delayed from Cyprus. A palace workshop waits. Smiths lack material. Soldiers receive fewer spearheads. A neighboring ruler complains that promised gifts have not arrived. The king orders metal from another source, but the road is unsafe. Merchants demand higher payment. Officials seize private stores. Craftsmen are reassigned. Rumors spread that the palace no longer controls supply. What began as a missing cargo becomes political weakness. Now add tin. Tin was the small ingredient that gave bronze its strength, and its rarity made it strategically vital. A world built on bronze could not treat tin as a luxury. It was essential. Yet precisely because it was essential, it exposed the fragility of the system. If copper was the body of the age, tin was its nerve. Without it, bronze production faltered. The movement of tin across long distances may have bound together peoples who never saw one another. A miner in a distant upland, a trader in a caravan town, a ship captain in a coastal harbor, a palace scribe in Syria, a smith in Mycenae, a warrior in a citadel. All were connected by a chain of need. None controlled the whole. All depended on parts they could not see. This is civilization as trust extended across distance. When trust fails, distance becomes danger. The collapse of trade also affected prestige. Bronze Age diplomacy was not conducted with words alone. Gifts mattered. Gold cups, fine textiles, carved ivory, horses, chariots, precious stones, metal vessels, and rare materials affirmed status between rulers. To send rich gifts was to declare strength. To send poor gifts was to invite insult. A king who lacked access to luxury goods could seem diminished, even if his army remained intact. In elite societies, appearance is not superficial. It is governance. Power must be displayed to be believed. The palace storeroom, the banquet vessel, the shining weapon, the imported perfume, the exotic wood, the engraved seal, all helped create the atmosphere of inevitability around rule. When such items became scarce, the spell weakened. Subjects might not understand the loss of a tin root, but they would see fewer rewards, poorer ceremonies, delayed payments, reduced feasts, and anxious officials. Trade routes also carried information. Merchants brought news. Sailors carried rumor. Envoys reported political shifts. Ports learned quickly when cities burned or kings died. When exchange networks frayed, information became less reliable. A ruler cut off from timely knowledge was more vulnerable. He might prepare for the wrong threat, trust the wrong ally, or underestimate a danger already moving toward him. The roads of bronze were roads of knowledge. Their failure narrowed the world, and yet, people adapted. They always do. Metal was recycled. Local crafts continued. Iron, once a difficult and limited material, slowly gained importance in the centuries around the transition. Communities shifted from palace-controlled international exchange toward more regional economies. The end of one system opened space for another. But for those whose authority depended on bronze, the change was not liberation. It was catastrophe. A palace without bronze was not merely poorer. It was less royal. The sound of the age changes when metal fails. Fewer hammers in workshops, fewer ships in harbors, fewer gifts in courts, fewer weapons issued from storerooms, more old blades repaired beyond dignity, more hidden hoards, more suspicious officials, More men asking why the king can no longer provide what kings have always provided. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not possess the ledger that records the first fatal delay. We do not know which caravan failed to arrive, which mine was lost, which port became too dangerous, which merchant turned away, which ruler hoarded the tin that another desperately needed. We find ingots, wrecks, tools, molds, tablets, weights, and broken objects. From these, we reconstruct a system as brilliant as it was exposed. The Bronze Age was built from fire, stone, skill, and exchange. Its metal shone like permanence, but its supply lines were delicate as thread, and when the threads began to snap, the sword still glittered for a while in the hands of warriors. The palaces still stood. The kings still spoke of strength. The temples still received offerings, but somewhere far away, on a road no king could fully guard, the future had already failed to arrive. There comes a moment in the life of a failing kingdom when the men trained to protect it become one of its greatest dangers. They know the roads, they know the storehouses, they know the weak gates, the hidden wells, the rivalries between towns, the pride of local chiefs, the fear of merchants, and the limits of palace command. They have carried bronze weapons under royal banners. They have eaten rations from state granaries. They have marched in formation, guarded caravans, driven chariots, crossed frontiers, and watched cities from the dust outside their walls. Then the payments stop. A warrior without a master does not cease to be a warrior. He becomes a question moving through the landscape with a spear in his hand. The late Bronze Age was not a peaceful world interrupted by sudden violence. It was a world built around organized force. Kings ruled through armies as much as through ritual and administration. Chariots were elite machines of war, requiring horses, trained crews, specialized craftsmen, wheels, axles, leather, bronze fittings, and disciplined support systems. Fortresses guarded roads and frontiers. Garrisons watched rebellious districts. Mercenaries were hired, rewarded, settled, and sometimes feared. Violence was not outside civilization. It was one of civilization's tools. In the great courts of the age, the professional warrior held an uneasy place. He could be honored for courage, rewarded with land, fed from palace stores, and tied to elite identity. But he also represented a permanent risk. Soldiers gather in groups. Soldiers compare leaders. Soldiers know when a ruler is weak. Soldiers can defend a palace or strip it bare. A strong king transforms armed men into order. A weak king inherits armed men as instability. When the palace systems began to fail, many warriors may have found themselves unmoored. Some were local retainers. Some were chariot elites. Some were infantry. Some were foreign mercenaries who had no deep loyalty to the kingdom that hired them. Some were sailors accustomed to violence along coasts. Some may have been displaced farmers who became fighters because hunger left them no gentler path. Some were raiders first and soldiers later, or soldiers first and raiders later. The categories blur in a collapsing world. A pirate is sometimes a merchant with fewer scruples and a desperate crew. A mercenary is sometimes a refugee with skill in battle. A rebel is sometimes a local leader abandoned by the center. An invader is sometimes a migrating community whose armed men walk at the front because no road is safe. The Bronze Age did not end in a clean war between civilization and outsiders. It frayed into countless armed decisions made by people under pressure. Chariot warfare had once been the pride of kings. To command chariots was to command speed, status, and terror. The chariot carried aristocratic imagery across the Near East and Aegean world. It required training, wealth, horses, and complex supply. In palace records, chariot parts and equipment appear as valuable assets to be counted and managed. A chariot force was not simply a collection of vehicles. It was an institution. But institutions are expensive. Horses must be fed. Wheels must be repaired. Bronze components must be replaced. Crews must be trained. Roads or open terrain must be suitable. Support personnel must maintain the system behind the battlefield spectacle. In a period of shortage, the chariot became both weapon and burden. A ruler struggling to feed his people might still need to maintain elite warriors whose loyalty was essential, yet whose cost was immense. If the palace could no longer support them, what then? Some chariot elites may have adapted into regional warlords. Some may have taken control of smaller territories. Some may have joined wider movements of violence. Others may have disappeared as social rank shifted and military practices changed. The collapse of centralized administration meant not only the loss of scribes and storerooms, but the transformation of the armed class itself. The sword did not vanish with the palace. It changed hands. In many regions, the period around the collapse saw new kinds of weapons and new patterns of fighting. Longer slashing swords, changes in armor, round shields, and infantry-focused combat may reflect shifting military realities. The exact interpretation is debated, but the broader point remains: war was changing. The elite chariot battlefield did not retain the same dominant meaning everywhere. More mobile, less centralized, more flexible groups of fighters may have gained importance. When great systems weaken, smaller bands become more dangerous. A palace army can crush scattered raiders when roads are secure, supplies are full, and command is clear. But if roads are unsafe, garrisons unpaid, fields failing, and allies unreliable, even modest groups of armed men can paralyze movement. They do not need to conquer an empire. They only need to make travel too risky, harvests too uncertain, and trade too costly. A handful of raids can change behavior across an entire region. Merchants delay departure. Farmers avoid distant fields. Villages hide grain. Officials travel with escorts. Messages arrive late. Local leaders begin making their own arrangements. The palace loses its reach not all at once, but mile by mile. Authority shrinks toward the walls. Warfare also feeds itself. A raid destroys crops, which creates hunger. Hunger creates movement, which creates fear. Fear creates defensive violence. Defensive violence creates revenge. Revenge creates new raids. Captives are taken. Goods stolen. Animals driven away. Young men who lose land or family may join the next warband. Weapons taken from the dead arm the living. The frontier moves inward. This is the world in which professional violence escapes its leash. The palace had once monopolized the right to organize large-scale force. It decided who served, who received rations, who bore arms, who guarded roads, who raided enemies, and who was punished as a criminal. When that monopoly weakened, violence became privatized. Local strongmen rose. Settlements fortified themselves. Communities depended less on distant kings and more on immediate defense. A farmer with a spear is not the same thing as a palace soldier, but in a desperate age, the difference may narrow. Archaeology catches glimpses of this transformation through weapons, fortifications, destruction layers, settlement shifts, and burial practices. A sudden increase in defensive architecture can suggest insecurity. Hidden valuables may imply fear. Weapons in unexpected contexts may hint at wider militarization. Burned villages and abandoned sites show that violence reached beyond royal battlefields into ordinary life. But the human experience is harder to recover. Imagine a soldier who served a palace for 10 years. He has marched under a king's emblem, eaten ration grain, and perhaps received a share of plunder. Then the palace burns, or the king flees, or the granary empties. His family must eat. His comrades gather. They still have weapons. They still know discipline. They still know where supplies are stored in neighboring towns. Their choice may not feel like villainy. It may feel like survival. History is full of such dark transformations. The same man can be protector in one season, raider in the next. Mercenaries complicate the picture further. Bronze Age rulers often used foreign fighters. Such men could be valuable precisely because they stood outside local politics. But their loyalty depended on reward. If a state could no longer pay, or if rival rulers offered better terms, mercenary groups might shift allegiance. In times of collapse, these trained outsiders could become carriers of military knowledge, violence, and cultural exchange across regions. Sailors, too, could become warriors of opportunity. The sea was not only a highway of trade, it was a theater of predation. A ship crew accustomed to long voyages, coastal navigation, and armed defense could turn raider if conditions favored it. Ports rich with goods, but weakened by shortage or political confusion, were tempting targets. Coastal communities could be struck quickly, their wealth taken before a distant ruler could respond. The line between naval commerce and piracy may have been thinner than official records admit, yet it would be wrong to reduce every armed group to greed. Many were probably driven by disaster. When homes are destroyed, fields fail, and old authorities vanish, people move behind those who can fight. War leaders gain followers because they offer food, land, protection, revenge, or simply direction. A band becomes a tribe becomes a migration becomes an invasion in the eyes of those already living where the hungry arrive. In this way, warfare and displacement become intertwined. The warrior without a master was not always alone. He might stand at the front of a moving population, shielding wagons, animals, children, and elders. He might fight not for plunder alone, but for settlement. This made him more dangerous, not less, because behind his weapon stood a need that could not be satisfied by a single raid: land, food, safety, a future. Such demands could not be negotiated easily in a world where everyone felt shortage. The great tragedy is that many of these fighters had once belonged to the systems they helped destroy. They were trained by palace economies, armed by palace workshops, fed by palace granaries, hardened by palace wars. When central order failed, the military skills accumulated by civilization scattered into the open, like sparks blown from a burning roof. And sparks find dry grass. The war that erased a civilization was not only the clash of named armies, it was the spread of armed insecurity through every level of life. It was the soldier unpaid, the mercenary unbound, the pirate emboldened, the peasant displaced, the warlord rising, the city watching its roads with fear. It was violence becoming local, mobile, and hungry. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names of most of these men. Their boasts are gone. Their songs are lost. Their graves, when found, rarely explain the loyalties they carried. A sword beside a body cannot tell us whether its owner defended a city or burned one. A spearhead in rubble cannot say whether it struck in conquest, panic, or revenge. But the pattern can still be seen. As palaces weakened, armed men mattered more. and kings mattered less. The old order had created specialists in violence. The collapse released them into a shattered world, and once war no longer belonged to kings. It belonged to everyone. A palace can look eternal from the outside. Its walls rise above the plain. Its gates control the road. Its storerooms hold the harvest. Its scribes command numbers from the chaos of life. Its ruler receives envoys beneath painted ceilings, while officials move through corridors with seals, tablets, and orders. To those standing in the courtyard, the palace appears to be the center of the world. Solid as stone, blessed by gods, guarded by men, fed by fields. But a palace is not stone alone. It is a system of belief, movement, obedience, storage, calculation, and fear. It exists only while thousands of people continue to act as if it exists. Farmers must deliver. Officials must count. Workers must accept rations. Soldiers must obey. Priests must bless. Messengers must arrive. Craftsmen must produce. Villages must believe that the commands written in the palace truly matter. When that shared obedience begins to fail, the palace becomes a building surrounded by doubt. The late Bronze Age palace economy was powerful because it concentrated resources: grain, oil, wool, livestock, metals, textiles, weapons, tools, perfumes, and luxury goods could be drawn inward, recorded, stored, transformed, and redistributed. This made possible astonishing achievements. Specialist labor flourished. Chariot forces could be maintained. Workshops produced fine goods. Temples received offerings. Diplomacy was supplied with gifts. Great building projects rose from organized labor. Centralization created splendor. It also created brittleness. A small household can improvise quickly. A village can adapt by custom, kinship, and immediate necessity. A palace economy, by contrast, depends on procedures. It must know who owes what, who receives what, who works where, who commands whom, and how goods move from one district to another. Its strength lies in order. Its weakness lies in the fact that disorder spreads through it like rot through timber. The administrative tablets of the Bronze Age reveal this world of command and dependency. They record rations, personnel, livestock, land, craft production, metals, textiles, and offerings. They show officials attempting to fix society into categories. This many workers, this much grain, this quantity of bronze, this number of animals, this district, this obligation, this delivery. A palace sees by counting, yet counting is not control if the counted world no longer obeys. Imagine a district expected to send grain after a poor harvest. The official arrives with authority, but the village has little left. If he takes what is required, families starve. If he takes less, the palace storehouse weakens. If he returns empty-handed, the king's command has failed. If force is used, resentment deepens. If force is not used, others may refuse. The system offers no easy answer because the system was designed for extraction from a functioning world. When function fails, administration becomes pressure. The palace also depended on specialists who could not simply feed themselves. Smiths, textile workers, chariot builders, scribes, guards, priests, perfumers, and labor crews relied in various ways on rations, assignments, or elite patronage. Such specialization is a sign of complexity, but complexity requires food moving steadily from producers to non-producers. If that movement breaks, the very people who make a civilization sophisticated become vulnerable. A hungry scribe cannot write order back into being. A bronze worker without metal is a burden to the system that once valued him. A chariot maker without spare parts, horses. And elite demand becomes a craftsperson trapped in a shrinking world. A temple singer without offerings, a guard without rations, a messenger without safe roads, all reveal the same truth. The palace was a web. Cut enough strands, and the web no longer holds weight. Redistribution had once made kings generous. In crisis, it made them targets. People expected the palace to provide because the palace claimed the right to collect. Authority and responsibility were bound together. A ruler who took grain in good years had to answer hunger in bad years. A ruler who demanded labor had to offer protection. A ruler who received offerings for the gods had to maintain cosmic confidence. If the palace failed to distribute food, defend roads, or honor obligations, its right to command could be questioned. Not always openly. Not at first. Doubt begins quietly. A village hides part of its harvest. A local official sends false numbers. A group of workers leaves its assignment. A soldier sells equipment. A merchant avoids a royal port. A priest speaks of omens. A vassal delays tribute. A family flees during the night. Each act may seem small. Together, they hollow out the state. The palace economy was also vulnerable because information moved slowly. A king might not know that a border district had failed until the messenger arrived. He might not know that a shipment was lost until weeks had passed. He might not know that a vassal had rebelled, a road had become unsafe, or a harbor had been attacked until the consequences were already spreading. The administrative mind loves order, but crisis travels faster than clay tablets. When orders arrive late, local power rises. A mayor, commander, clan leader, landholder, priest, or military chief can become more important than the distant king if he can provide immediate protection. In times of fear, people look not toward the most legitimate authority, but toward the one who can open a granary, organize guards, settle disputes, and survive the next raid. Central power does not always collapse in a single blow. Sometimes it is quietly replaced by nearer hands. This may be why the end of palace systems often produced smaller political worlds, not empty worlds, not lifeless worlds, smaller worlds. Regions that had once been tied to great centers continued under local forms of authority. People still farmed, herded, traded, worshipped, and fought. But the large administrative structures faded. The palace no longer gathered the countryside into a single commanding rhythm. The archives stopped because the institution that needed them had stopped. The disappearance of writing in some areas was not the disappearance of intelligence. It was the disappearance of a bureaucracy. Writing survived where institutions continued to require it. Where palace administration failed, scripts tied to that administration could vanish from ordinary use. The people did not forget how to think. They no longer lived in a system that paid scribes to count sheep, bronze, oil, workers, and offerings in the same old way. A script can die when its employer dies. Material culture records this shift with quiet force. Imported luxury goods decline in some regions. Pottery styles change. Large centralized buildings give way to smaller structures. Workshops shrink or relocate. Settlement patterns alter. Burial customs transform. Fortifications become more local. Wealth appears less concentrated or differently displayed. The archaeological evidence does not merely show destruction. It shows a change in the grammar of life. The palace had once organized space itself. There were central halls, storerooms, archive rooms, workshops, courtyards, elite residences, processional areas, and controlled entrances. These arrangements taught people where power lived. To enter a palace was to move through hierarchy built in stone and plaster. When such buildings burned, were abandoned, or ceased to function, the physical theater of authority disappeared. A king without a stage is diminished. Ritual, too, was affected. Palaces and temples were closely tied in many Bronze Age societies. Offerings required resources. Festivals required organization. Sacred objects required care. Priests and rulers reinforced one another. If the palace could no longer supply ritual abundance, the religious order may have seemed wounded. In a world where divine favor mattered deeply, this was no minor issue. A failed harvest might be weather. A burned city might be war. But a king unable to restore balance could be judged abandoned by heaven. That judgment could turn practical crisis into ideological collapse. Once people stop believing the center is favored, competent, or necessary, obedience becomes negotiable. The palace depends on armies, but armies depend on loyalty and supplies. It depends on archives, but archives depend on officials who still report reality. It depends on roads, but roads depend on security. It depends on gods, but gods must be seen to answer. The palace system failed because it was asked to absorb too many shocks at once. Drought strained surplus. Trade disruption weakened supplies. Armed groups threatened routes. Earthquakes and fires damaged infrastructure. Diplomatic networks faltered. Local leaders improvised. Refugees moved. Soldiers lost confidence. Subjects questioned extraction. Each pressure attacked a different organ of the same body. No single wound explains the death. The body bled from many places. Still, collapse was not pure chaos. It was transformation under duress. The palace world gave way to more fragmented, more local, more flexible arrangements. Communities that survived did so by shedding the weight of systems that had become impossible to maintain. In that sense, the end of the palace was also the release of human life from a broken machine. But for those who lived through it, the change must have felt like the end of order. The great storerooms empty, the officials gone, the seals unused, the courtyard silent, the throne room roof fallen, the tablets baked by fire, the old commands no longer spoken, the king's name fading from daily fear into memory. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The palace was the masterpiece and the trap of the Bronze Age. It gathered the world into itself so brilliantly that when it fell, the world it gathered fell with it. In the mountains and highlands of Anatolia, an empire vanished into silence. It had not been a small thing. It had not been a fragile tribe clinging to a few hill forts, nor a nameless kingdom lost beyond the edge of memory. The Hittite Empire had once stood among the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Its kings wrote to pharaohs as equals. Its armies crossed plains and rivers. Its laws were written down. Its treaties called gods to witness. Its capital rose behind mighty walls in a landscape of rock, wind, and sacred height. Hatti was a world of storm gods, royal oaths, fortified gates, scribes, archives, festivals, chariots, and imperial ambition. Then it was gone, not completely gone, for no civilization disappears as if swallowed whole by night. People remained. Languages endured in altered forms. Traditions survived in successor kingdoms. Cities continued elsewhere. Memories were reshaped. But the imperial structure, the great kings of Hatti, the power that had once confronted Egypt and ruled over vassals in Syria, ceased to exist. The center no longer held. The royal voice no longer commanded the same horizon. The fall of Hatti is one of the most haunting mysteries of ancient history because it feels both sudden and slow. At Hattusa, the capital, the ruins still carry the weight of a state that expected permanence. The city was not built casually. It was a planned, monumental, sacred, administrative landscape. Walls followed the contours of the hills. Gates were decorated with lions, sphinxes, and warrior figures. Temples filled the city, honoring a crowded divine world. The royal citadel stood above the lower city. Archives preserved treaties, rituals, letters, prayers, laws, and historical texts. This was not merely a seat of government. It was a cosmic engine. The Hittite king was not simply a war leader. He was chief priest, judge, diplomat, commander, and keeper of oaths. He stood between gods and people, between vassals and imperial authority, between the living and the ancestral dead. The stability of the empire depended not only on soldiers, but on ritual correctness, dynastic legitimacy, and the constant renewal of bonds through ceremony and command. Such a system could appear immense, yet it was under strain long before its final silence. The Hittite realm was difficult to govern. Anatolia is a land of rugged distances, harsh winters, high plateaus, river valleys, mountain routes, and regional identities. Holding it together required force, diplomacy, loyalty, and constant attention. Vassal rulers needed supervision, borderlands needed defense, rival powers needed containment. Famine, plague, rebellion, succession disputes, and enemy pressure all appear in the wider Hittite record as recurring burdens. An empire is not a statue. It is a struggle repeated every year. One of Hatti's great problems was geography. Its heartland could be defended, but it could also be isolated. Its access to the wealth and politics of Syria mattered deeply. Northern Syria offered routes, cities, tribute, and contact with the wider diplomatic world. But it also exposed the empire to conflict with Egypt, Assyria, local dynasts, and restless populations. To maintain imperial prestige, Hatti had to keep its distant dependencies obedient. That required resources. Resources require harvests, transport, manpower, and confidence. In the later years of the empire, signs of stress multiply. Grain shortages appear as a concern. Diplomatic appeals and movements of food hint at difficulty. The Hittite state may have faced famine severe enough to require supplies from abroad. Such dependence would have been dangerous for a great king. A ruler who must seek grain from outside his land is not necessarily weak, but he is exposed. His enemies see need. His vassals see vulnerability. His subjects feel uncertainty. Hunger at the imperial heart is never only hunger. It becomes politics. It becomes rumor. It becomes rebellion waiting for a season. The Hittite royal house also knew internal struggle. Succession was not always smooth. Rival branches, court factions, ambitious relatives, and regional interests could turn dynastic transition into danger. Even a powerful empire can be damaged by uncertainty at the top. When the person of the king is bound to divine favor and legal order, a contested throne can make the entire realm tremble. Every oath depends on the question of whom it binds. If vassals suspect weakness, they test limits. If military commanders doubt the center, they act independently. If provinces sense that tribute will not be enforced, they withhold. If enemies see confusion, they move. A contested dynasty in a time of shortage and foreign pressure can turn imperial scale into imperial vulnerability. Assyria, rising in power to the east, added another threat. The balance of power in northern Mesopotamia and Syria was shifting. Hatti had long operated in a world of great kings, but that world was not fixed. Assyrian expansion challenged old arrangements and placed pressure on territories that mattered to Hittite influence. The empire had to defend not only its borders, but its reputation as a power that could still protect allies and punish disobedience. Reputation is a weapon until it cracks. Then it invites attack. There were pressures from the west and southwest as well, where lands known through Hittite texts as troublesome and shifting entities appear in the background of imperial concern. Western Anatolia was not a quiet frontier. It held kingdoms, alliances, rival powers, and possibly connections to the Aegean world. The names are difficult, the geography debated, the political relationships complex. Still, the impression is clear enough. Hatti was surrounded not by emptiness, but by ambitious neighbors and unstable edges. An empire can fight on one frontier. It can negotiate on another. It can suppress rebellion in a third. But if too many edges ignite, even the center begins to feel far away from itself. Then there is Hattusa itself. The final abandonment of the capital remains strangely difficult to read. Some evidence suggests that the city may have been deliberately emptied in part before its final burning. This is not the picture of a simple surprise attack against a fully functioning capital. It suggests movement, decision, perhaps relocation, perhaps contraction, perhaps a royal administration already withdrawing. If so, the burning of Hattusa was not the first act of collapse, but one of its final visible signs. A capital can die before it burns. Its officials leave. Its archives are moved or neglected. Its workshops slow. Its sacred spaces lose processions. Its storerooms empty. Its gates still stand, but fewer commands pass through them. The city becomes a shell of authority, waiting for fire, looting, weather, or memory to complete what politics has begun. What happened to the last great kings? Their names flicker near the edge of darkness. Suppiluliuma II, among the final rulers, appears in records connected with military activity, naval conflict, and a world under strain. Yet the documentary trail fades. The royal line disappears from the old imperial stage. The voice that once issued commands across Anatolia and Syria becomes quiet. The archive does not give us a final royal lament. No last king stands in the record to say, "This is how Hatti ended." That absence is almost unbearable. We want the final scene, the last council. The gate opened at night, the priest carrying sacred images away from the temple, the soldiers unpaid, the royal family departing through smoke, the enemy entering the upper city, the last scribe hiding a tablet beneath a floor, the final prayer to the storm god above the broken land. Archaeology gives fragments, not theater, and still, from fragments, the shape of disaster emerges. Hatti faced environmental stress, food shortages, military pressure, unstable vassals, shifting trade routes, possible internal conflict, and the general violence of the collapsing Bronze Age world. It did not need one executioner. It was surrounded by knives. When the empire fell, Anatolia did not become empty. The old imperial world fragmented into smaller political formations. In parts of southern Anatolia and northern Syria, successor states preserved elements of Hittite culture, language, art, and royal ideology. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms carried pieces of the old world into the Iron Age. The storm god still stood. Hieroglyphic inscriptions still proclaimed kingship. Lions still guarded gates. Civilization did not vanish. It changed scale. Yet the loss of the Hittite Empire was profound. A great diplomatic partner disappeared. A major military power left the stage. The balance of Syria and Anatolia shifted. Trade routes changed. Old treaties became meaningless. Vassals became independent or vulnerable. The imperial archive closed. The title of Great King no longer radiated from Hattusa with the same force. Silence spread where orders once traveled. The fall of Hatti reminds us that even the largest powers can be more fragile than they appear. Its walls were enormous, its rituals ancient, its kings formidable, its scribes meticulous, its armies experienced. But none of these could guarantee survival when the systems beneath them began to fail together. A kingdom may be strong in battle and weak in harvest. It may be rich in records and poor in grain. It may command vassals who obey only while fear lasts. It may carve gods into stone and still wonder why heaven has gone silent. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath the stones of Hattusa, beneath Anatolian mounds, beneath mountain roads and ruined temples, more answers may yet wait. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, the Empire of Hatti stands as one of the great ghosts of the Bronze Age collapse, a superpower of storm and oath, broken not by one blow, but by the gathering of many. In the hills and plains of Greece, the age of palaces ended in smoke, but the people did not vanish. That is the first truth to hold firmly. Mycenaean civilization collapsed, but Greece was not emptied of human life. The citadels lost their old authority. The scribes disappeared. The palace workshops fell silent. The great halls no longer gathered tribute from the countryside. Yet families still lit fires. Shepherds still moved with flocks. Farmers still bent over fields. Children were born into a world poorer, smaller, and more uncertain, but not dead. The darkness that followed was not an absence of people. It was an absence of records. The Mycenaean world had been one of fortified centers and palace command. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Medea, and other places had shaped the landscape through stone, hierarchy, and administration. Their rulers lived within citadels that looked as though they had been raised for giants. Later Greeks, staring at those walls, called them Cyclopean, because only one-eyed giants seemed strong enough to lift such blocks. Myth grew in the cracks where memory had lost its records, but archaeology shows that these walls belonged to human societies of astonishing organization. The palaces governed territories, directed production, counted goods, managed labor, and stored wealth. Linear B tablets preserve the language of administration, not epic poetry. But through those dry entries, the machinery of power becomes visible. Officials recorded sheep, grain, oil, bronze, wheels, armor, land, offerings, and people. The palace did not merely rule by sword, it ruled by knowledge. Then the tablets stopped. At Pylos, the destruction fire preserved a final archive by accident. The palace burned, and the clay tablets, which might otherwise have dissolved back into earth, were baked hard. Their survival is a cruel blessing. They do not tell us who burned the palace, or how the last defenders died, or where the king went, but they show a system still operating near the moment of ruin, still assigning, counting, watching, and preparing. The palace of Pylos was never rebuilt in its old form. That fact matters more than the fire itself. Ancient buildings often burned. Cities could recover. Rulers could rebuild. But when a palace is destroyed and its administrative world does not return, Something deeper has happened. The institution has failed. The roof falls, and beneath it falls a system of command. At Mycenae, the walls remained, but the world they had enclosed changed. The citadel still dominated the landscape, its famous gate guarded by carved lions, its graves filled with memories of warrior wealth, its stone passages heavy with the pride of older kings. Yet the palatial order faded. Elite power continued in altered ways. But the grand redistributive system no longer functioned as it had. At Tiryns, damage, rebuilding, and continued occupation reveal a more complicated story. Collapse was not a single line drawn across the map. Some centers were destroyed, some contracted, some adapted. Some people remained among ruins that had once proclaimed royal control. There is something deeply human in that image ordinary life continuing beside the remains of a failed order. The end of Mycenaean Greece was not only an architectural event, it was a social descent. The large-scale palace economy vanished. Long-distance exchange weakened. Monumental building declined. Writing disappeared from Greece for centuries. Craft specialization narrowed. Population patterns shifted. Some settlements were abandoned. Others moved to more defensible or more modest locations. Burials changed. Pottery changed. Wealth became less concentrated in the forms once associated with the palace elite. For later historians, this became the Greek Dark Age. Yet that phrase must be used carefully. Dark for whom? Dark for us, because fewer written sources survive. Dark for palace elites? Certainly, because their world ended. But for many ordinary people, the collapse of the palace may have meant terror, hunger, and loss, while for others it may eventually have meant freedom from heavy obligations. The disappearance of a royal bureaucracy can be catastrophe and release at the same time. Still, the centuries were hard. Communities became smaller. Connections narrowed. The splendid international world of the late Bronze Age gave way to a more local existence. Goods that had once traveled from distant regions became rarer. The old heroic courts, if such courts lay behind later memory, were gone. The world of chariot warriors and palace feasting receded into story, and story would eventually turn memory into legend. Here lies one of the strangest transformations in ancient history. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces may have helped create the soil from which Greek epic later grew. The poems of heroes, kings, sieges, ships, bronze weapons, and doomed cities do not preserve history in any simple way. They are not archives. They are songs shaped over generations. Yet somewhere within them may flicker distorted memories of the Bronze Age world-fortified citadels, warrior elites, sea journeys, raids, palace wealth, and the trauma of destruction. Memory survives by changing costume. A burned palace becomes a tale of cursed houses. A forgotten ruler becomes a hero. A conflict among late Bronze Age powers becomes a war sung beneath later skies. A world of scribes and administrators becomes, in memory, a world of bards and kings. When writing returns to Greece, the old palace script is gone. A new alphabet will eventually carry new kinds of thought, new poetry, new law, new politics. But between the palace tablets and the later alphabet lies a long silence. That silence is not empty. It contains generations. Imagine a family living near the ruins of a former citadel. The old walls still stand above them, immense and weathered. Their grandparents may remember stories of officials and storerooms, of commands sent from the palace, of soldiers gathering, of fire in the night. Their children know the stones as part of the landscape, haunted but familiar. They no longer read the old tablets. They no longer serve the same king. The world has shrunk to fields, kin, animals, local chiefs, seasonal dangers, and memories recited by firelight. Civilization has not ended. Scale has changed. This is one of the deepest lessons of Mycenae's fall. Collapse is not always the disappearance of a people. It is often the disappearance of a structure that once gathered people into a larger order. When the palace failed, Greek society did not dissolve into nothing. It reorganized itself through smaller units, local leaders, kin networks, villages, farms, and regional identities. In losing the palace, Greece lost writing, centralization, and much of its old wealth. But it did not lose human creativity. The long road from Mycenaean collapse to later Greek city-states was not straight. It was uneven, regional, and filled with obscurity. Yet the ruins of the Bronze Age remained in the landscape, silent teachers of grandeur and warning. Later, Greeks walked among tombs and walls whose makers they only partly understood. They inherited stones without records, names without certainty, memories without archives, and perhaps that is why myth grew so powerfully there. When facts vanish, imagination does not. It builds bridges across darkness. The end of Mycenaean Greece also reminds us that writing is not guaranteed. A society can possess a script, use it for administration, and then lose it when the institution supporting it collapses. Linear B was not forgotten because people became less intelligent. It disappeared because the palace world that needed it was gone. Knowledge tied too tightly to one system can fall with that system. In the ashes of Pylos, the tablets survived. But the scribal tradition did not. There is tragedy in that. There is also transformation. The people who lived through the post-palace centuries carried forward language, customs, stories, skills, and identities in forms that archaeology can only partly recover. Their pottery may seem modest beside palace wealth. Their settlements may seem small beside citadel grandeur, but they endured. And endurance is not a lesser achievement than empire. The Mycenaean world entered darkness not because people ceased to live, but because the light by which we see them dimmed. The palaces burned. The tablets stopped. The kings faded. The walls remained, staring over a changed land. Sheep grazed beneath monuments built for rulers whose names were no longer spoken with certainty. Rain fell on shattered courts. Grass grew through places where officials once counted bronze and grain. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath Greek hills, under later temples, below villages and fields. More traces of that transition may wait. A sealed destruction layer, a forgotten chamber, a burial that shifts the chronology, a clay tablet with one more breath from the palace age. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, Mycenae stands as a warning carved in stone. Even walls built for giants cannot protect a world whose foundations have already failed. Egypt survived. That single fact has often made its story seem like a victory. And in one sense, it was. While other kingdoms disappeared, while palaces burned across the sea, while old trade routes buckled and ancient powers lost their voice, Egypt still stood beside the Nile. Its temples remained. Its scribes continued. Its gods still received incense. Its king still wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Its fields still drank from the river when the inundation came. But survival can be mistaken for strength. Egypt lived through the storm, yet it did not emerge unchanged. It endured, but wounded. It defeated enemies, yet exhausted itself in the struggle. It carved triumph into stone. Yet behind the scenes, the old imperial confidence was fading. The pharaoh could still appear enormous on temple walls, smiting foreign foes beneath the gaze of gods. But the world that had supported Egyptian greatness was no longer the same. In the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt faced one of the most dramatic crises of the age. At Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, the walls display a vast theater of war. There are battles on land and sea. Enemy ships are crowded with warriors. Egyptian archers fire into packed vessels. Foreign fighters fall beneath the discipline of Pharaoh's forces. Ox carts, families, weapons, shields, and strange headdresses fill the scenes. The message is clear. Chaos came against Egypt, and the king destroyed it. These carvings are among the most important images of the Bronze Age collapse. They are also royal propaganda. To read them wisely, one must hold two truths at once. The threat was real. The presentation was shaped. Egyptian kings did not cover temple walls with humble uncertainty. They presented themselves as defenders of divine order against disorder. Their enemies were made into symbols of chaos. Their victories were eternal, perfect, and blessed. The pharaoh did not merely win a battle. He restored the universe. Yet the need to proclaim victory so loudly may itself reveal fear. Egypt had long known foreign war. It had campaigned in Nubia, Libya, Canaan, Syria, and beyond. It had fought Hatti. It had controlled or influenced cities in the Levant. It had received tribute, traded for luxuries, and drawn wealth from a world of movement. But the crisis under Ramesses III felt different because it came during a time when surrounding systems were failing. Egypt was not simply facing an enemy army. It was facing the consequences of a region in upheaval. The Nile gave Egypt resilience. Unlike rain-fed kingdoms, Egypt depended heavily on the annual river flood. This did not make it invulnerable, for poor inundations could bring famine and unrest. But it gave the Egyptian state a powerful agricultural base. The long ribbon of fertile land along the Nile could feed a population and sustain institutions even when distant trade faltered. Geography protected Egypt as well. Deserts guarded its flanks. The sea and Sinai formed gateways that could be watched, fortified, and fought over. But geography is not a shield against everything. Egypt needed the outside world. It needed timber from abroad, especially cedar and other woods not easily available along the Nile. It valued copper, tin, silver, horses, luxury goods, foreign servants, and political influence in the Levant. Its empire had grown by reaching beyond the Nile Valley. When the Levantine system fractured, Egypt's outer world shrank. Ports that once connected it to wealth and diplomacy became vulnerable. Vassal cities weakened. Old arrangements lost force. A surviving kingdom in a collapsing neighborhood inherits danger. Ramesses III appears as a warrior king because his reign required defense on multiple fronts. Libyan groups pressed from the west. Seaborne and land-moving peoples threatened from the north and northeast. The state had to mobilize soldiers, ships, supplies, fortifications, and labor. Victory in such conditions was not cheap. Every battle consumed grain. Every campaign required organization. Every defense pulled resources from other needs. The temple walls show enemies dying. They do not show the cost of victory in empty granaries, delayed wages, anxious workers, and strained administration. In the years after the great battles, Egypt's internal problems became harder to hide. One of the most striking signs comes from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the skilled workers who built royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These men were not ordinary peasants. They were state-supported artisans, literate, organized, and essential to royal funerary culture. When their rations were delayed, they protested. A workers' strike in ancient Egypt is a remarkable thing. It reveals a system under strain not through a battlefield, but through bread. The men complained because the grain owed to them had not arrived. They stopped work. They gathered. They spoke to officials. Their actions show that even in the sacred machinery of royal tomb building, the state could falter. The divine king still ruled, but his administration struggled to feed its own specialists on time. This is what wounded survival looks like. Not instant collapse, not flames consuming Memphis or Thebes, not the disappearance of writing or kingship. Instead, erosion, delayed payments, tomb robberies, corruption, local officials gaining power, temples becoming wealthier and more politically significant, royal authority gradually narrowing. Egypt remained ancient, sacred, and impressive. But its imperial age was passing. The later New Kingdom could still produce grandeur, but the momentum had changed. Egypt's control in the Levant weakened and eventually receded. The great age of Egyptian expansion into Syria and Canaan faded. Foreign policy became more defensive. The wealth flowing from empire diminished. The pharaoh remained a god-king in ideology, but ideology cannot fully conceal economic contraction and political fragmentation. Over time, the balance between king, priesthood, army, and regional powers shifted. The victory of Ramesses III did not restore the world of Thutmose III or Ramesses II. It preserved Egypt from immediate ruin. That difference matters. A state can win battles and still lose an era. It can defeat invaders and still become poorer. It can keep its capital and still lose its empire. It can carve victories on stone while its foundations weaken in ledgers, fields, and workshops. Egypt's survival was real, but it was survival within a changed international order. The old network of great kings had broken. The Hittite Empire was gone. Ugarit was gone. Mycenaean palatial power was gone. Many Levantine cities had been damaged or transformed. Egypt stood among ruins and called itself victorious. Perhaps it was, but the silence around it must have been immense. Imagine an Egyptian official looking northward in the early Iron Age. The familiar diplomatic world is altered beyond recognition. Some old partners no longer reply. Some cities have new rulers. Some peoples have settled in lands once governed through Egyptian influence. Trade continues, but not with the same rhythm. Reports from the coast are uncertain. The old map of power has become unreliable. Egypt's greatest strength was continuity. Its civilization was deeply rooted. Its temples held memory across centuries. Its scribes preserved traditions. Its agricultural cycle gave rhythm. Its people knew how to endure political change under the long shadow of sacred kingship. Unlike some palace systems that vanished when their administrative centers burned, Egypt possessed a broader and more durable institutional landscape. Temples, local administrations, priesthoods, and scribal culture could absorb shocks, but continuity can harden into burden, maintaining monuments, rituals, officials, tombs, armies, and temples required resources. The past itself was expensive. Egypt carried the weight of its own greatness. In prosperous times, that weight became splendor. In strained times, it became pressure. The gods still needed offerings. The dead still needed tombs. The state still needed grain. Soldiers still needed pay. Workers still needed rations. Officials still expected status. When less wealth flowed in, every obligation grew heavier. The end of the Bronze Age did not erase Egypt because Egypt was older, larger, more agriculturally secure, and more institutionally layered than many of its neighbors. Yet the crisis marked the end of its supreme imperial confidence. The pharaoh remained magnificent in image, but the reach of his hand shortened. Egypt became less the master of a wide eastern Mediterranean order and more a powerful, enduring land guarding its own ancient heart. There is a melancholy grandeur in that. The temples still glowed at sunrise. Priests still purified sacred spaces. Scribes still shaped words with black and red ink. Farmers still watched the river. Statues still received offerings. Kings still claimed eternity. But beyond the borders, the Bronze Age world had cracked apart, and Egypt could not command it back into being. The Nile kept flowing. The empire did not, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We see the carved triumphs, the administrative complaints, the delayed rations, the tomb robberies, the shifting power of temples, and the fading grip abroad. We can trace the outline of exhaustion, but not every fear spoken in the palace, not every argument among officials, not every household that wondered whether the old order would hold. Egypt survived the war that erased a civilization, but it survived as an old giant, bleeding beneath gold. Ugarit died with its letters still undelivered. There are ruins that feel distant because they belong to a world so old that imagination struggles to cross the gap. Ugarit is not like that. Ugarit feels close because its final traces are full of unfinished business. Messages still waiting, warnings still sharp, orders still formal, archives still arranged around the belief that someone would read, answer, seal, dispatch, and obey. Then the city burned on the northern coast of the Levant, near the sea roads that bound the eastern Mediterranean together. Ugarit stood as one of the most remarkable cities of the late Bronze Age. It was not the largest empire. It did not rule like Egypt. It did not command like Hatti. But it mattered profoundly because it was connected. It was a port kingdom, a meeting place of ships, roads, languages, gods, merchants, diplomats, craftsmen, and scribes. Its wealth came from being between worlds. To the west lay Cyprus and the Aegean. To the south lay the Levantine coast and Egypt. Inland were Syria, Mesopotamia, and the routes toward Anatolia. Goods moved through Ugarit like blood through a heart. Copper, textiles, oil, wine, grain, timber, ivory, metals, luxury objects, and messages all passed through its systems of exchange. The city lived by movement, and so when movement became dangerous, Ugarit was exposed at every gate. Archaeology has given Ugarit a strangely intimate afterlife. Its palaces, houses, temples, and archives have yielded thousands of texts. These tablets reveal a literate, multilingual society. Scribes wrote in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. They used local alphabetic cuneiform for their own language. They recorded myths, rituals, legal transactions, economic accounts, diplomatic letters, and administrative matters. Ugarit was a city where writing was not an ornament. It was a tool of government, religion, commerce, and memory. In its texts, we see a society both worldly and sacred. God stood close to daily affairs. Ritual life mattered. Kingship mattered. Trade mattered. Law mattered. A tablet could preserve a myth of divine conflict or a dispute over property. It could record offerings to a deity or instructions involving ships. The city's mind was written in clay, and because the city burned, much of that mind survived. There is a terrible irony in preservation through destruction. Had Ugarit lived on peacefully, many tablets might have returned to dust. Because fire consumed it, the clay hardened. The end became the archive. The flames sealed the evidence of the flames. Near the end, the city appears to have been deeply vulnerable. Some of its forces may have been absent, possibly serving elsewhere or committed to obligations beyond the city. Its fleets or troops were not where they were needed. Letters suggest anxiety over enemy ships and the need for defense. The city was not ignorant of danger. It saw something coming, or at least heard reports of movement and threat. Yet knowledge is not salvation. A warning without soldiers is only fear made official. One famous letter from the wider Ugaritic archive has often been read as a desperate communication involving enemy ships and the inability to defend the land. The exact context and interpretation remain debated, as always with fragmentary ancient texts. But the emotional force is unmistakable. Here is a city entangled in crisis, trying to communicate through the channels of a world that may already have broken. The letters do not present a neat final diary. They are not written for us. They do not say, "Tomorrow the city will fall." Their power lies in their incompleteness. They show a world still functioning, yet failing. A king, an official, or an ally still speaks in formulas of responsibility and response. The machinery of diplomacy still turns, but perhaps too slowly. The sea does not wait for clay to dry. Imagine the last days of Ugarit. In the harbor, ships are expected, feared, or missing. Sailors argue in the heat. Merchants watch warehouses filled with goods that may never be loaded. Officials count supplies and send orders. Priests enter temples heavy with incense, asking the gods to preserve the city. Families hear rumors but do not know which to believe. Some say enemies have landed elsewhere. Some say help is coming. Some say the king's troops are away. Some say the roads inland are no longer safe. Every rumor has weight when walls are all that remain between life and ruin. In the palace, scribes continue their work. That image matters. Even in danger, bureaucracy persists. Clay is prepared. Messages are pressed. Seals are applied. Perhaps orders are sent for ships, troops, grain, reinforcements. Perhaps accounts are checked because the state still believes accounts matter. Perhaps some tablets are stored while outside. The city's fate approaches. Civilizations often continue their routines until the instant they cannot. A mother may still grind grain on the morning of a city's destruction. A merchant may still bargain. A scribe may still correct a sign. A priest may still lift an offering. A guard may still complain of thirst. The end of the world rarely announces itself clearly to those inside it. It arrives disguised as another bad day, then becomes the day from which no one returns. When destruction came to Ugarit, it was severe. The city did not recover as the same kingdom. Its palatial and administrative life ended. The archives were buried beneath the debris of collapse. Buildings burned. Objects were left behind. The kingdom's place in the international world vanished. The port that had once linked civilizations became a ruin, its voice sealed beneath ash. The silence of Ugarit is especially painful because the city had been so articulate. Some ancient places die mute. Ugarit dies mid-sentence. Its myths preserve divine struggles and cosmic drama, yet its own final drama remains hidden in broken evidence. Its diplomats knew the language of empires, yet no diplomatic solution saved it. Its merchants knew the sea, yet the sea may have brought danger. Its scribes knew how to preserve agreements. Yet no tablet could bind a collapsing age back together. The fall of Ugarit shows the Bronze Age collapse at human scale, not as a map of Eros, not as a list of destroyed sites, not as a debate over climate, migration, trade, or war, but as a living city caught in a net that tightened around it. Ugarit was vulnerable precisely because it was sophisticated. Its connections gave it wealth, and those same connections carried crisis into its streets. The harbor that had brought luxury could bring raiders. The roads that had carried trade could carry refugees or enemies. The obligations that tied it to greater powers could leave its defenders absent at the decisive hour. A small kingdom in a great system may prosper beautifully. It may also be sacrificed by forces larger than itself. Ugarit's death also reminds us that collapse was not only the end of political structures, it was the end of households, careers, friendships, obligations, and futures. Behind every tablet was a hand. Behind every sealed room was a person who expected the room to matter. Behind every cargo was labor. Behind every temple offering was hope. Behind every wall was fear. The archaeological record can make catastrophe seem clean because it reduces life to layers. Destruction level, burned archive, collapsed wall, abandoned settlement. But no one lived inside a destruction level. They lived in streets, courtyards, workshops, bedrooms, shrines, markets, and harbors. They knew the smell of bread and fish, the sound of animals, the heat of stone, the gossip of neighbors, the pride of city identity. Then smoke entered everything. What became of the survivors, if there were survivors? Some may have been killed, some captured, some fled inland, some joined other communities. Some carried memories of Ugarit into a world no longer able to restore it. Perhaps children who escaped grew old telling stories of a city by the sea where scribes wrote in clay and ships came from distant lands. Perhaps those stories changed, faded, and vanished. Human memory is softer than fired clay. That is why the tablets matter so much. They are the hardened remnants of a world that did not intend to become evidence. They do not answer every question, but they let us stand close to the last breath of a Bronze Age kingdom. They show that collapse was not abstract. It was correspondence interrupted. It was help requested too late. It was danger seen but not stopped. It was a city whose systems still worked just long enough to record that they were failing. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The exact attackers remain debated. The precise sequence of events remains uncertain. The final hours are lost. No complete account names every decision, every betrayal, every absence, every flame. We have ruins, tablets, ash, and silence. Yet from these, Ugarit speaks more clearly than many cities that lived longer. It tells us that the Bronze Age did not simply fall in palaces and battlefields. It fell in messages never answered. It fell in harbors where ships no longer meant safety. It fell in archives where the last words were preserved only because the roof came down in fire. Ugarit's final night remains one of the most haunting windows into the collapse. A place where history does not feel ancient at all, but immediate, fragile, and terribly human. After the ashes, the world did not end. That may be the strangest truth of all. Cities burned, empires broke, palaces fell silent, old scripts vanished from daily use, trade routes changed. Kings who had called one another brother disappeared into broken tablets and ruined walls. Yet the sun still rose over the eastern Mediterranean. Rain still fell in some valleys. Seeds still entered the soil. Children still learned the names of their ancestors. Fires were lit in smaller houses beside the ruins of greater halls. The Bronze Age was gone, but humanity remained, and perhaps that is where the deepest meaning of the collapse begins. Not in destruction alone, but in survival. For the people who lived through that long age of disruption, there was no neat boundary between the world that had ended and the world that had begun. There was only hunger, movement, rebuilding, memory, loss, and the hard labor of continuing. Civilization is often imagined as something made from monuments, walls, temples, palaces, tombs, archives, thrones. But the collapse reminds us that civilization is also made from habits: how people plant grain, how they bury the dead, how they divide food, how they remember law, how they teach children, how they carry stories when records fail, how they reshape old gods for new landscapes, how they turn ruin into dwelling, and fear into custom. The Iron Age did not emerge from nothing. It grew from the wreckage of bronze. Across the eastern Mediterranean, smaller kingdoms, villages, chiefdoms, city-states, and regional cultures began to form new patterns. Iron slowly became more important, not because it was instantly superior in every way, but because the old bronze networks had weakened and new technologies, resources, and political arrangements began to matter. Local production gained new value. Communities could adapt outside the shadow of great palace systems. The world became less centralized, but not less alive. In the Levant, new peoples and polities took shape. The Philistine cities developed along the southern coast, blending influences from the Aegean and local traditions into something new. Inland highland communities grew in importance. Phoenician cities, heirs to older Canaanite traditions, would become masters of maritime trade, carrying alphabetic writing, goods, and cultural influence across the Mediterranean. From the broken networks of the Late Bronze Age came new routes, new ships, new ambitions. In Anatolia and northern Syria, successor kingdoms preserved fragments of the Hittite world, royal imagery, storm gods, monumental inscriptions, and political traditions endured in changed form. The imperial center had fallen, but memory traveled. The past was not copied exactly. It was reassembled. In Greece, the long post-palace centuries eventually gave way to new social forms. Writing returned, not as linear B, but through the alphabet. Communities that had lived in the shadow of Mycenaean ruins began, over time, to create the foundations of the polis. Later Greek civilization, with its poetry, philosophy, colonization, warfare, law, and political experiment, grew not from uninterrupted palace grandeur, but from a landscape that had endured collapse and learned to begin again. This is one of history's great paradoxes. The fall of the Bronze Age destroyed a world of kings, but it opened space for different worlds. No one living through famine, raid, abandonment, or fear would have called it opportunity. That would be cruel. Collapse is suffering before it becomes a chapter in a textbook. It is the loss of homes, the failure of promises, the death of children, the silence of shrines, the humiliation of elites, the wandering of refugees, the hunger of workers, the grief of survivors. Yet across generations, human beings do what they have always done. They adapt, borrow, remember, forget, and transform. The Bronze Age collapse is not a story of human failure alone. It is a story of systems failing around human beings who continued to live. The palaces had claimed permanence. They had counted the world in grain, wool, bronze, labor, and tribute. They had turned kingship into spectacle and administration into power. But when the great systems broke, life did not wait for permission to continue. It flowed around the ruins. It narrowed, hardened, changed direction, and then widened again. There is humility in this. The people of the Late Bronze Age were not foolish for building complex systems. Complexity allowed them to create wealth, art, diplomacy, architecture, writing, law, and long-distance connection. Their world was magnificent because it was interconnected. But the same interconnection made it vulnerable to cascading shocks. Drought in one region, war in another, failed trade somewhere else, moving peoples, broken supply lines, shaken walls, and weakened kings could combine into a disaster no single ruler could master. That lesson is not comfortable. It tells us that collapse is rarely simple. It is not always the punishment of decadence, nor the triumph of barbarians, nor the wrath of gods, nor the consequence of one bad harvest or one lost battle. It is often the moment when many pressures meet a system that has lost flexibility. It is the hour when institutions built for command cannot listen quickly enough to reality. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath ancient mounds, more tablets may sleep in clay. Beneath coastal waters, shipwrecks may hold cargoes from final voyages. Beneath fields and later cities, destruction layers may wait for careful excavation. Radiocarbon dating may refine chronologies. Isotope analysis may trace movement. Genomic data may reveal patterns of migration and mixture. Archaeobotany may sharpen the story of drought and survival. Future discoveries will not remove the mystery entirely, but they will change its shape. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, the Bronze Age collapse stands as one of the great turning points in human history, a wound between worlds. On one side, the age of great palace kings, chariot elites, bronze economies, royal brotherhood, and clay archives. On the other, the harder, more fragmented, more experimental world of the early Iron Age, where new peoples rose, new scripts spread, and new political forms slowly emerged from the dust. The war that erased a civilization was not only a war of armies, it was a war of hunger against storage, distance against trade, fear against trust, movement against borders, local survival against imperial command. It erased the palace world, but not the human spirit that had built it. So we leave the ruins as night settles over them. The gates are broken. The halls are empty. The scribes are dust. The kings are names. Yet somewhere beyond the fallen walls, a small fire burns. Around it sit people who have lost much, but not everything. They speak. They remember. They plan for morning. And from such fires, history begins again.